Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Child Watch. My name is Hannah Ennis, and I'm a member of the Inner City Youth Orchestra of Los Angeles. I am very proud to kick off today's event with the performance of Samuel Coleridge Taylor's Variation for Cello. Coleridge Taylor was a 19th century Black English composer, conductor, and activist.
Good morning and welcome. I am Shimica Gaskins, and it is my privilege to serve as the Executive Director of Children's Defense Fund, California. First, a huge thank you to Hannah Ennis for that beautiful performance. Hannah is a senior at Hamilton High School's Academy of Music and Performing Arts and the principal cellist at the LA City Inner City Youth Orchestra, the largest Black majority orchestra in the United States, with just over 100 members ranging in age from 12 to 28. Hannah and the orchestra are grantees of our friends at the LA Department of Arts and Culture, who support arts, education, youth development, creative well-being, and healing-informed art programs for students and incarcerated youth. Together, we are proud to lift up the talent and promise of our young people. So thank you again, Hannah, for sharing yours with us today. And thank you all for attending Child Watch, the state of California's children and youth in the COVID era. The Children's Defense Fund has a long history of hosting Child Watch events, and I am proud to bring this event to California and what will become an annual convening focused on the health and well-being of children across the state. But before I go on any further, I want to thank our generous presenting sponsor, the California Wellness Foundation, whose mission is to improve the health of Californians and is dedicated to promoting equity through advocacy and access. Your support through this convening will allow us to continue to address the systemic inequities that have for too long prevented our children from reaching their full potential. I want to also thank our champion sponsors, the Conrad Hilton Foundation, First 5 LA, LA Care Health Plan, and Weingart Foundation. Your support allows us to further our mission by bringing together a larger community to explore what we can do together to make sure we leave no child behind. And thank you to all our other Child Watch sponsors, foundations, nonprofit organizations, and individuals who share and support our vision. When we all stand up for children together, I am certain we can bring about the critical changes our children need. And now, I'd like to share short videos from the California Wellness Foundation and the LA Care Health Plan.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to extend warm greetings to each and every one of you. I wish we could all be together to gather in person today for such powerful conversations that are poised to ensue. I want to extend a special thank you to Shimica Gaskins for your tremendous leadership and to the amazing team at Children's Defense Fund California for your work, your service, your leadership to improve the quality of life for children, for youth, and for families. Thank you for all you do, and thank you for bringing us together for today's Child Watch event. On behalf of the California Wellness Foundation, we want to extend a special greeting to your new president and CEO, Reverend Dr. Starsky Wilson. And we want to thank and say hello to each and every one of the amazing panelists who will engage us today. Today's theme could not be more appropriate, a call for radical transformation. Radical transformation. COVID-19 revealed so much about what does not work for many California families. But we know that the history of these inequities goes back much further in time. And now in 2021, we have the opportunity to rebuild in new ways that advance equity and promote greater investment in our communities. So today is just a first start. But again, we want to extend on behalf of the Wellness Foundation our gratitude for this event and for the work of Children's Defense Fund California. Thank you, God bless you, and onward.
As your community health plan, LA Care wants all Angelinos to know that we are here to help. For the past 23 years, LA Care has been a leader in providing healthcare access, providing care for all through our Medi-Cal, Medicare, and Covered California health plans. We understand that when we are all covered, we are all in a better place. To learn more, visit lacare.org. LA Care, for all of LA.
Since 1998, we have worked to lift children and families out of poverty by ensuring that they have access to a quality healthcare and equitable education, as well as respectful and rehabilitative and effective supports in the justice system. Many of the advocates who are with us today have worked towards these same goals. However, California still leads the nation in children who live in poverty. Too many children continue to be pushed out of school, and LA County still has more youth incarcerated than any other jurisdiction. And those three stats were pre-pandemic. Now, here we are, a year after some of our most vulnerable communities were asked to shoulder the disproportionate effects of COVID-19. For many children in our state, it has been a full year since they've seen the inside of a classroom. And while we cannot truly quantify the loss associated with these facts, we must remember that behind every staggering statistic, somewhere there's a child whose promise is in jeopardy. And it is for these children and youth that we are determined and committed to doing more, and we are certain more can be done. Our children need and deserve our best efforts. So today we have created a space to discuss and take a deep dive into the inequities that are affecting children and youth, especially our Black, Brown, Indigenous, and low-income youth. And with the help of some extraordinary panelists and experts and leaders in our state and around the country who have graciously agreed to think about the issues affecting California's children for the next few hours, we will talk about what transformation looks like when we really center children and families in our decision-making and action. So let's get to it. I'm excited to introduce our next speaker, Reverend Dr. Starsky Wilson, who took the helm of Children's Defense Fund in December after our founder, Marian Wright Edelman, transitioned into her new role as President Emerita. Dr. Wilson is a national thought leader in racial justice, community organizing, and movement building. He's a champion for children's rights and has a long-standing relationship with the Children's Defense Fund, having led the effort to bring CDF Freedom Schools literacy and empowerment program to children and families in the St. Louis area, and then serving as a leader of our annual CDF Proctor Child Advocacy Ministry Institute. It is my pleasure to introduce him as our new president and CEO and welcome him virtually to California today.
Hello, my name is Starsky Wilson. I had the pleasure and honor of serving as the president and CEO of the Children's Defense Fund. A great deal of that honor, of course, is following in the legacy of our founder and President Emerita, Marian Wright Edelman, and an extended element of that honor is serving alongside our California Executive Director, Shimica Gaskins, whom I had the occasion to meet over the course of the last few years on the grounds of Alex Haley Farm, doing the kind of movement building work that we need to make sure that all of America's children thrive. In the context of this pandemic moment, we learn more than any other time, perhaps in our lifetimes, that the systems that have been built around, purportedly for, and on behalf of America's children find themselves in distress and perhaps were never built for their flourishing. At some moment, perhaps to save them, at others to protect them, but never oriented to make sure that they are well, that they are flourishing, that they can thrive. And it's our position that this is the moment, in the context of the crisis that we find ourselves in, to finally re-envision, revitalize, reform, and send forth systems to assure that children have the opportunity and the occasion to thrive. And so we're glad that you have joined us in this moment, that you have joined us in this work. One of the critical texts that came out last year in the context of the pandemic was by Dr. Eddie Glaude. There he wrote in a title, Begin Again, about the work of James Baldwin, of the need in times of crisis and times of challenge to do, in the words of the book of Revelation, your first works over, to do your first works over, return to your foundational principles, consider your own origins, and be mindful of the places where you began. One of the places where our story at the Children's Defense Fund began, one of the stories of our origin, of course, came when Mrs. Edelman invited Senator Robert Kennedy to see, to experience, to watch what was happening in the situation of poverty for children in Mississippi. The importance of proximity, coming to the point of need for children, pausing and turning aside, considering our first commitments, is what Child Watch is all about. And so I'm grateful to the team in California under the leadership of Shimica for bringing you all together to turn aside, to watch, to consider doing our first works over. Over the last few months, we've been doing that at the Children's Defense Fund, noting that our vision is for a nation where marginalized children flourish, where leaders prioritize their well-being, and where communities wield the power to ensure they thrive. That being said, we're really excited about today's convening, where you are having the opportunity to learn from people that I have studied and spent time with for some time. People who are doing the work to help us re-envision how we engage around children and youth and how we consider our values as a nation. I'm grateful that you will learn, of course, from our partners, Dr. Ginwright, to learn from Dr. Bettina Love, to learn from our friend and dear brother, Mayor Tubbs, all of whom have been guideposts, who have been signs, who have been teachers for each and every one of us. And of course, we're glad to have our keynote speaker that I get to present to you to be a guide for this conversation today as well. Dr. William Barber is one of the leaders of Repairers of the Breach, a senior lecturer and president there, and also, of course, one of the co-chairs of the Poor People's Campaign, a moral movement here in America. He served as the president of the NAACP there in North Carolina. He, of course, gave a powerful and rousing speech at the Democratic Convention in years past. We also have known his voice as one to call us back to our revolutionary roots, to call us into a revolution of values, and to call us forth to a third reconstruction, to call us forth to a fusion politics. I was honored just last week in a setting with our clergy colleagues from across the country with the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference to honor Dr. Barber by presenting him with an award that is named for another guide for all of us, Ella Jo Baker. In receiving the Human Rights Award, a name for Ella Jo Baker, for the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, he called us all forth into new work in this moment, to consider again the need to gather together, to build on the agenda for poor people that Mrs. Edelman served as the policy director for decades ago in that first Poor People's Campaign. And so it is in that spirit, and with my great appreciation to the team there on the ground and to our teachers throughout this Child Watch that I'm able to present the Reverend Dr. William Barber, Bishop Barber, a grand leader of our movement and our times, calling us at the CDF, calling us in the Children's Defense Fund, calling us as a nation committed to children and the well-being for the future to do those first works of the Poor People's Campaign over, to do the work of moral imagination again, so that we might be who God is calling us to be. We might be who our children need us to be. We might be what the transcendent calls for in this moment. We might be the future of America that our children deserve. We're grateful to be able to present Dr. Barber. We're thankful for his time with us and look forward to the teaching and the challenge that he will surely have for us. Blessings to you.
Thank you so much, and we're so honored by the grace of God to be here with you. My dear brother, I am praying for you mightily, and I'm very serious about that ever since I heard about your appointment to lead the Children's Defense Fund. You are the Joshua for this moment. I know great prayer and great thought went into that. I'm so thankful for our dear sister, leader of us all, Mary Wright Edelman. Some people may not know, when we decided to relaunch the Poor People's Campaign, the National Call for Moral Revival, first person I went to sit with was Mary Wright Edelman, because she was the policy director for the campaign. You're right that she said to Robert Kennedy, you have to come here and see this. And she was very strong, as Mary Wright Edelman is. She was very clear. If you're gonna do this, don't play with it. And don't ask for less than what's already been pushed. She said, make sure that what you talk about with children come from the Children's Defense Fund, because we've done this work for years and not around it. And she shared with me some of the things that happened then, and I am forever grateful for her encouragement and for her prayers. And to all of you who gather, my brothers and sisters in California, we love you this day and bring you greetings on behalf of Preparers of the Breach, the Poor People's Campaign, my co-chair, the Reverend Dr. Leah Steele Harris, and the tremendous California Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. In these 30 minutes that I have before we take questions, I want to talk about some facts. I know we say, well, people talk about the problem, but you have to name it in order to change it. And so I want to talk about why we have to fight for the agenda Children's Defense Fund puts forth, Poor People's Campaign puts forth, in light of the where we are. But before we get into the why and the where, I want to lift up some words. And they are words that came from Dr. Martin Luther King that are often left off in these days. And I think left off to our detriment of understanding the depth of what he was saying to us then, and not just him, but all of the people, male and female, Black and white, Jews, Muslims, and Christians. Oftentimes we are told that at the March on Washington, Dr. King said, I have a dream. Actually, he didn't. He didn't just say, I have a dream at the March on Washington. He had done I have a dream at the March on Detroit. He had used I have a dream as a closing in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, before ever going to DC. It was a refrain. It was called out of him that day by Mary Wright Edelman, who said, by Mahalia Jackson, who at the end of his remarks that day said, Doc, don't forget to tell him about the dream. But the title of the speech that day was Normalcy Never Again. And the agenda was a Civil Rights Act that would even have provisions in it that would say to school systems, if you discriminate, we will pull your federal resources and take them from you. And also there was in the agenda a call for a $2 minimum wage and labor rights. And the $2 minimum wage then would be $15 today. And Dr. King looked at America and said, normalcy never again. He was thinking about those in the present, but he also was thinking about children. He said, I have a dream of a time when my 4 little children will grow up and not be judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. And he knew that the only way to get there was through public policy and through a prophetic moral decision that people would say, normalcy never again. The last night he was with us, in 1965, at the end of the Selma to Montgomery March, a lot of people never listened to that speech. Dr. King reminded us, he said, every time there is the possibility for the Negro masses and the white masses, particularly poor and low wealth people, to get together and form powerful political blocs, the aristocracy, the greedy, sow division in order to undermine the kind of political power that could bring the beloved community to existence, where everybody, every human being, every male, every female, every adult, and every child could live out what it means to be a human with dignity. And then on the last night he was with us, people say his speech was, I've been to the mountaintop again. That wasn't the speech, that was a closing. It was a closing that even Andrew Young had said, he had heard him say it before, but something about that night had more power, but you missed the entirety of what Dr. King was saying. For actually the title of the speech, or the essence of the sermon was, he said, I look at this country, we have a sick nation. He said, some people told me not to come here, but the question is not what would happen to me if I come here, what would happen to poor people, what would happen to others if I didn't. He was there fighting for family, for adults, men particularly at that time, who were garbage workers that had families, and they were being mistreated economically, socially, racially. And Dr. King was clear that they couldn't take care of their families, they couldn't take care of their children unless there was a change, so he went to Memphis. And in Memphis, he said, we have a sick nation. We've got to give ourselves to this movement. We either go up together, we go down together. And then here's the title of the speech. Nothing would be more tragic than for us to stop at this point. 63, normalcy never again. 68, nothing would be more tragic than for us to stop at this point. And I want to suggest that is true today. Normalcy never again. We cannot be just about getting back to prior to COVID. Normalcy never again. And nothing would be more tragic than for us to turn back now. I have crisscrossed this country visiting poor and low wealth leaders from California to the Carolinas, from Appalachia to Alabama, from Michigan to Missouri, from the Tenderloin in San Francisco to the tough parts of the Delta in Mississippi. And I know from those visits and from listening that there are 5 interlocking injustices that say we cannot stop at this point. The 5 interlocking injustices that are with us, that are hurting our children and our families. First, systemic racism in all of its format, not just police reform, but resegregation of public schools and cutting of public education and the disparities in healthcare and income that impact Black children and white children and brown children and indigenous children. Systemic racism, voter suppression, because we know that every state that is a voter suppression state in this country is a high poverty state, a high child poverty state, a low income state, a low wage state, a non-union state, and a state that in fact cuts public education. But also we have to address systemic poverty. Prior to COVID, there were 140 million poor and low wealth people in this country. 43% of the nation prior to COVID was poor and low wealth. Right now, only 39% of people in America can afford a $1,000 emergency. Right now, before COVID, 60% of Black people were poor and low wealth. That's 26 million people. 30% of white people were poor and low wealth. That's 66 million people. 68% of Latinos, 60-some% of natives. But then we have to add to that systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the denial of health care. Before COVID, 4 million families could get up every morning and buy unleaded gas and couldn't buy unleaded water. 89 million people were either uninsured or underinsured. And we're still a country where your health care is determined by your job and not your humanity. And then before COVID, we had the war economy, where before COVID, we were spending 54 cents of every discretionary dollar on the war economy and less than 16 cents of every discretionary dollar on education, healthcare, and wages and infrastructure. Imagine that. One contract for Boeing could cover every state that has refused to expand healthcare, could cover all the people that need healthcare, just one contract for 1 year. And then the fifth thing is interlocking injustice is this theological malpractice of religious nationalism and white evangelicalism that tries to suggest that a faithful life is not about caring for the poor and lifting the children, but about being against abortion, being against gay people, being for tax cuts, and trying to suggest Jesus was a founding member of the NRA, which is at best malpractice and at worst heresy. That was where we were prior to the pandemic, which is why we just can't go back to that. Normalcy never again. Nothing would be more tragic than for us to turn back now. But then let's think about California. Prior to the pandemic in California, when you look at these 5 areas, in California, 51% of the people of your state are poor and low wealth, low income. And this is not a movie, this is real. 20 million people, 62% of all the children, 5.6 million, 54% of all women, 10 million, 61% of Black people, 1.3 million, 71% of Latinos, 10.7 million, 38% of white people, 5.6 million. So Black people in California, 61% of Black people are poor and low wealth, 1.3 million. 38% of white people are poor and left, but that's 4 million more in raw numbers than white people. And from 1979 to 2012, the income for the top 1% grew by 190%, while the income for the bottom 99% fell by 6%. In the area of systemic racism, 48% of 1.7 million eligible Black voters and 47%, 7 million of eligible Latino voters are in your state. And whenever there are any laws that do anything to undermine voting rights, it's hurtful. More than 22,000 residents cannot vote due to felony disenfranchisement. That's 63,000 Black people, 3% of the Black population in California. Over 131,000 people are in prison in California. That's 79% of them are people of color. 79% are people of color. Black residents of California are incarcerated at 9 times the rate of white residents. Surely we cannot be fighting for normalcy ever again. When it comes to militarism and the war economy, from 2008 to 2014, the California law enforcement received $152 million in federal military equipment. And California taxpayers contributed $9.7 billion to the military. And yet in your state, over 380,000 veterans have incomes less than $35,000. That's 20% of the veteran population in California makes less than $35,000 a year. In California, you have sent $97 billion into the military while you suffer when it comes to funding for education for all people. California has 120 ICE detention centers. Over 827,000 people were deported from California between 2003 and 2018 in California. 13% of the K through 12 students have undocumented parents. When it comes to ecological and health, even in California, where you expanded healthcare and the Affordable Care Act, still 2.7 million people are uninsured. 19% of the census tracts in California are at risk for people being unable to afford water. And California currently ranks 36th out of all states for the quality of child education. 69% of fourth graders are not proficient in reading. 71% of eighth graders are not proficient in math. Non-white school districts receive an average of $2,390 less in funding per student than white districts. Poor non-white school districts receive less. 4.3 million people in California benefit from SNAP. And as of 2015, 1.8 million children live in food insecure households. That's 21%, a fifth of all children are in food insecure households. 31% of children in California have parents without secure jobs. That's 2.8 million children. Over 129,000 people in California are homeless. In California, if you work at the state so-called minimum wage, you have to work 116 hours a week to afford a basic 2-bedroom apartment, maybe a couple of meals with meat, and possibly a used car. 6.4 million people make less than $15 an hour, while we have senators, Democratic senators, arguing against right now raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. 42% of all Californians make less than $15 an hour, the 30th highest of all the states. The minimum wage in California is $12 in 2019, but the living wage in your state is $30 an hour. $30 an hour. $30 an hour. When we hear this, and it's important to hear this, in his book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, Dr. King once said, we can never tire of hearing the facts, because it's hearing the facts that keep our prophetic edge, keep our moral intensity up. Frederick Douglass once said that when you hear things and when you see the realities, what it should do is embolden our agitation and our discontent. And to say to friend and foe, normalcy never again. And nothing would be more tragic than for us to stop now. In the times in which we live, we're in an interesting time because people sometimes are offering so far below what's possible. We don't have a scarcity of money in this nation. We don't have a scarcity of power. We have a scarcity of will. We have a scarcity of language. Have you ever noticed how even many times people that call themselves progressive have a hard time saying poor, poverty? They say people trying to make it into the middle class. No, some people are poor and low wealth. If you can't say their names and say their conditions. We did a study in Poor People's Campaign, and it was entitled Unleashing the Power of Poor and Low Wealth Votes. And we found out that almost 1/3 of America's voting population is poor and low wealth. 1/3, 65 million people. 29 million people voted in 2016, 35 million voted this year. Our campaign touched 3.1 million poor and low wealth people. And poor and low wealth people voted at a rate of 55% for the ticket that just went in, not so much because of the individuals, but because they heard them say, elect us, and we're gonna get 15 in the union. And they did not say, unless the parliamentarian says no. They said, we're gonna expand healthcare, so we're gonna deal with racism. But they also said in that study, the majority of the reason why poor and low wealth people don't vote is because they never hear people talking about their situation. We have campaign after campaign, presidential, Senate, gubernatorial races, and they never talk about poverty. You've not heard one presidential debate in the last 40 years that has been dedicated to the issue of poverty, even though nearly 50% of the people in this country are poor and low wealth. And 39% of this country, that's all that can afford a $1,000 emergency. There's something wrong. You can go to churches and never hear a sermon on poverty, even though that was what Jesus talked about at the beginning of his ministry and at the end of his ministry. You go to synagogues and never hear a word about it, even though the great prophet like Isaiah said, woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor. You can go to civil rights organizations meetings and never hear a conversation about poverty, but they ask people to pay $200 for a banquet ticket. You can go to conference after conference after conference and never hear a focus on poverty, never hear a real focus on these 5 interlocking injustices and how they connect. And the reality is we must decide normalcy. Never again. And nothing would be more tragic than for us to stop at this point, which means we can't just accept things that people are offering. Give you an example. In this current COVID relief bill right now, the Poor People's Campaign put out 14 points. I'll share with you in a minute for healing the nation. We said to the president, to the vice president, to the senator, you can't heal the nation unless you deal with the sickness of poverty and racism and so forth. Healing the nation is not just not talking like Trump. That doesn't mean you're healed. That means you're shrewd enough to be quiet. That doesn't mean the nation is healed. Healing the nation is not some false form of compromise where you pat people on the back, but you still don't deal with the issues of poverty. Healing the nation means you recognize that this pandemic has exposed the fissures of racism and poverty that existed before. Healing means that you start showing people that, for instance, something like racist voter suppression might be targeted at Black, brown, and indigenous people, but in essence, it's an attack on the entire democracy, because when the people who use racist voter suppression get power, they use that power to cut education and cut healthcare and cut living wages. Which is why you might be in California, but you also got to be concerned about what's happening in Mississippi and North Carolina and Georgia, because those senators there in those 13 former Confederate states have impact on you in California. And that's why we've got to link up state by state by state and have a fundamental transformation and build power and change the narrative. Normalcy never again. Somebody said the COVID relief bill, and I know somebody might get mad with me, but I love you now. They said the COVID relief bill that we're passing, Reverend Barber, it's okay, be okay. It's gonna end 50% of poverty. First of all, that's not true. First, 50% of child poverty. First of all, it's not true. Because the current poverty measure in America is 55 years obsolete. It was obsolete when it was written, because in this country, the current government poverty measurement says if you make $12,761 a year, you are not poor. I don't use this often, but I must say it today. That's a damn shame to even have the nerve as a government to say if somebody makes $12,761 a year, they're not poor. Or as one politician said to me, well, Reverend Barber, we have the minimum wage at $7.25. And so that puts people $3,000 over being poor. Yeah, $7.25 gives you about $15,000 a year. About $1,200, $300 a month, about $283 a week. Mr. Millionaire Senator, you try living off that. The living wage, as you see in California, should be $30. The March on Washington, they asked for $2 minimum wage 57 years ago, and that would be 15 today. We have to even challenge those who say they're working for us, but what they offer doesn't defend the children, it deludes the children. It makes us end up fighting for less than what ought to be. Somebody said, well, you know, if we do this, it's going to change poverty for 50% of the children, because we're going to do a child tax credit. Well, if you do a child tax credit, but you don't raise the parents' living wage, how is that going to raise the children out of poverty? If the parents are poor and low wealth, I don't care how many tax credits you give them, that's not going to address poverty. And then, by the way, especially the Children's Defense Fund, if somebody comes talking to you all about they're going to put something in place that will take 50% of the children out of poverty, you ought to say, well, our leader, Mary Wright Edelman, and the Children's Defense Fund 10 years ago said if you take 2% of the federal budget and use it in programs that work, you can end 60% of the children that are in poverty. So you asking us to go 10% back from what we already figured out 10 years ago. There are some that are saying in this debate right now over a living wage, well, the parliamentarian rule. Parliamentarians don't rule, they advise. And the other side, what we should know is the parliamentarian and the filibusters are not constitutional provision. Those are things that were put in the Senate, mostly by white men, and particularly sponsored by white male Southerners or white racists from other places, to slow down legislation, because the parliamentarian advised against every anti-slavery bill and said it could not be put on the floor. The parliamentarians ruled against the progressive Reconstruction bills of the after post-Civil War. The parliamentarians ruled against the Civil Rights Movement. People like Hubert Humphrey challenged the parliamentarian, Nelson Rockefeller, even Trent Lott, who I do not like from a policy standpoint. When the parliamentarian wouldn't give him a tax cut for the wealthy, they fired the parliamentarian. You can never say that one parliamentarian can have more power than an elected senator or an elected vice president. One parliamentarian can have more power than 62 million poor and low wealth people. That we're going to lean into a system that was developed to stop civil rights and stop women's rights and undermine public education, undermine labor rights. No, normalcy never again. Nothing would be more tragic than for us to stop now. So in light of all of this, we got to fight for full voting rights. We've got to fight for living wages. We got to fight for guaranteed income. We got to fight for universal health care. We've got to fight to redirect some of that bloated defense budget of over $800 billion. You know, we cut the defense budget in half. We still have more money than North Korea, China, and Iraq and Iran and Russia combined. We've got to fight to secure quality, equitable, diverse public education and end resegregation of schools. We got to fight for that now. We got to fight to increase funding for early childhood education, Head Start and early Head Start. We've got to fight to increase funding for public K through 12 schools. We have to fight for funding formulas that consider poverty rates and homelessness and unemployment rates and connectivity. And we've got to fight to increase SNAP and WIC and SSI and SSDI. Yes, we have to fight. Yes, fight, non-violently, but fight. We've got to fight to have the kind of technology infrastructure that can provide reliable and secure online and remote training, learning options to support public education. We have to fight for recreational facilities, fight for more money in the arts and music and culture. We have to increase funding to support students with disability and English language learning programs. We have to support teacher training and support teacher funding and support education and higher wages for public school teachers, especially those in poor and low income communities. We have to protect and expand the programs for individuals with disabilities. We have to fully fund SNAP and yes, we have to do the child tax credit. Yes, the economic income tax credit. Yes, yes. We must fully expand and fund child care and development block grants to meet the child care and early childhood development needs of poor and low income families. Yes, yes, we must use money to reinstate the over 300,000 jobs lost in the child sector. Yes, we must have a living wage because a lot of our poor parents are tip workers, and tip workers make $2.13 an hour, and the whole process of tipping grows out of the post-Civil War era, which was designed not to pay the former slaves the wages that they deserved. Yes, we have to guarantee that this vaccine goes everywhere it must go in poor and low wealth communities. Yes, we must have an infrastructure program that particularly focuses on green jobs and building in poor and low wealth communities and hiring in poor and low wealth communities. Yes, yes, we must do all of this. We must fight for all of this. And we must declare normalcy never again. We must say deep in us, wow, because every generation has its Selma. Every generation has its Edmund Pettus Bridge. Every generation has its abolition moment. This is just our moment. And we must declare nothing would be more tragic than for us to be satisfied or to stop at this point. Because in every one of these areas, the last and final question that we must ask is, how are the children? And no matter what Wall Street is doing, no matter what a few of us may do that have moved up to the rank, if the children are not well, then the normalcy is not right. If the children are not well, then when we stop, we abandon the children. If the children are not well, then the nation is sick and in need of healing. God help us to never accept normalcy again. And God help us to declare with the breath we have left. I don't know how long we're going to live. In the midst of COVID, some people have died that we didn't think would die. Mortality is all around us. The breath you have in us, about if you lose 6 minutes of breath, for most of us, that's it. 6 minutes and your whole life is in it. But maybe this is the time to say, with the breath I have, whether it's 7 minutes or 7 days or 7 weeks or 7 months or 77 years or 70 years left, I'm going to declare with all of those who are wanting to fight for justice, nothing would be more tragic than for us to stop at this point. God bless you. The chair.
Reverend Barber, thank you so much for being here. Your words are such a balm and powerful stirring of the spirit so that we aren't discontent. I feel emboldened that normalcy, never again, is what we need to continue to push for today and in the coming days. So just thank you again for being here. And I think we have enough time for maybe one or two questions. And, you know, you talked about how CDF and your work has closely aligned over the years. And I think, you know, we've been inspired and supportive of the Poor People's Campaign and the repairs of the breach. And so I wanted to just talk a little bit about our interest of your interest in our work here in California and the work of the great movement that has been built in the California People's Campaign. And, you know, one of the things that you talked about in the inaugural address was about how we lose $1 trillion every year to the effects of child poverty.
Yep.
And you talked about how we shouldn't be asking the government like what the cost of that is to repair inequality, right? But how much it will cost not to. So if we invested that amount of money, as you have been pushing and fighting for, what kind of impact do you think it will have on the children? And what can we specifically be pushing and saying, this is what this will do?
Yeah, and we think about that. We lose $1 trillion by keeping children poor. So we would gain $1 trillion by raising children out of poverty. Mm-hmm. And that trillion wouldn't go to the Cayman Islands. Right. It wouldn't go to the Swiss banks. It would go into our communities. It would go into infrastructure development. It would go into businesses and jobs. You know, we also lose about $2 to $4 trillion a year from gender inequality, wage inequality. Mm-hmm. So poverty and low wealth is a losing formula. It only helps those at the very top, but it ultimately undermines. You know, if you think about it, if the nation is a pyramid, you only have a few people at the 1%. But if you got a pyramid and 50% of that pyramid is wobbly, that pyramid is not going to last long. It's crumbling. We could see communities rebuilt. Think about $1 trillion into the federal government, directed at teachers, directed at education, directed at healthcare, directed at living wages. People say, well, it's social. No, it's not. You know what it is? Justice. Mm-hmm. And the Constitution says if you establish justice, then you can ensure domestic tranquility. That's but right. You can't ensure domestic tranquility unless you establish justice, and you can't hold on to domestic tranquility unless you provide for the common defense and promote the general welfare. Mm-hmm. So these issues are not left and right; they're about what's right and wrong. Mm-hmm. You know, we're going to spend $16 trillion dealing with COVID. $16 trillion, an estimate. The Economic Policy Institute says that we cannot see the recovery we need if we just go back to 2018, if we just 2019, if we just hold on to where we are. There has to be a radical transformation. And I mean radical in the most progressive way, for people to recover out of this pandemic. If there's one good thing in the midst of the gruesome and grotesque deaths of COVID, is it has forced us to see just how interconnected we are. You know, one little germ, you think about this, one little germ, and my bishop who consecrated me, Bishop Yvette Funder in Oakland, y'all know her, she said, one little germ that looks like a tennis ball with dreadlocks has done it. We got all these missiles, they can't blow it up. We can blow the world up 100 times, but we can't, none of that is helping us with this. Only investment in healthcare, only investment in development, only investment in our children in school. So lastly, let me say that question came from Joseph Stiglitz. Joseph Stiglitz is a Nobel Peace Prize economy, wrote a little book called, powerful book, everybody ought to get it, called The Price of Inequality, or The Cost of Inequality. He says, we asked the wrong question, not what is the cost to fix it, but what is the cost of leaving it the same? And that's one of the reasons, last year we had a mass Poor People's Assembly Moral March on Washington digitally. 2.7 million showed up. We're going to do another digital, but in 2022, I'm going to announce it now, first time to do, we need to have a generationally transformative mass gathering of poor and low wealth people and low wage workers and low wage folk. And we're going to do that because we've got to put a face on this to force the nation to move in some new direction. No more hiding, no more invisible, no more.
Yeah. Well, I am so just grateful, as a child who grew up in these circumstances, to have it named and to be seen. And you have been a champion of making sure that we name poverty, we name the conditions under which so many unfortunately have to live, and it's not right and it's not just. And I think, in our work here at CDF California, we really focus on economic justice, and you really laid that out today, what that means, because I think often people don't really understand what it looks like, but you gave us so much richness to really move that forward and continue to push the agenda. And I think my last question for you really is, so what gives you hope in this moment?
I think about that question so much because I'm not an optimist. Because to be an optimist, you have to have optics where you see things. And we don't always see good. We see a lot of bad. Like we saw people in the Congress yesterday vote against voting rights, vote against a reform bill, say they want to block living wages, they want to cut guaranteed income, unemployment and sick leave. But then we saw them arguing about Mr. Potato Head's gender. And we saw them arguing about some racist stuff that the Seuss organizations took out. I mean, it makes you weep and then it makes you curse. So I want to define hope for a theological has to look at despair until you gain the faith to suffer underneath the despair in order to transform it. In other words, you look right at the despair and you lift it up and you declare that it doesn't have the last word. It's not optimism, not being happy. You actually name it for all that it is until you are so moved that you can't do anything but suffer underneath it because you challenge it. And then in that possibility, that's how you change it. And so what gives me hope? All of the folk I have met around the country that have every reason to quit. All the people in the Poor People's Campaign in California, the people I've met in the hollers of Kentucky and Tennessee, I mean, in the Delta, Mississippi, and when we talk about building a movement, they're like, yes, they're ready. They said, somebody told me poor people don't like to be called poor. So I asked poor people, they said, we don't know, what we don't like is being poor. We don't like a nation that creates this poverty because it's not something that's people's fault. It's created by public policy. She said, that's what we don't like. So we want somebody to finally see us, call our names, recognize us. And I never will forget, one day I was in the Tenderloin down in San Francisco. I was down there visiting Cecil Williams and Glide Memorial. And I was walking on the street, what gives me hope. And I was feeling kind of bad that day. I have crazy arthritis from some other stuff. And this brother walks up and said, Reverend Barber, we with you. And he was on the street. He said, we with you. He said, when we come, I'm coming. We gonna somehow, and this brother was on the street and we started talking, right? I never knew that, bro. I didn't know who, would never met him. But he was saying, like, thank you for at least making it an issue. And this brother said, we got to fight out of this. Now, a lot of people would have dismissed him, but I saw him as a leader because we believe in the efficacy and the power of poor and low wealth people. And we have to connect poor and low wealth people, moral leaders and their advocates. And we become a powerful collective force. We could change things. And so that's what gives me hope. And then lastly, what gives me hope is the critics. A few weeks ago, I found out that McDonald's was alleged by Vice News that some people in the upper echelons of the McDonald Corporation decided to put me under surveillance and Mary Kay Henry under surveillance and the poor workers under surveillance for fighting for 15. And I thought about it first. I said, they went, and the allegations, they went all the way to England and hired some company. Now they're trying to say, well, they were just doing Google alerts, but you don't have to go to England to do that. So we know it was some kind of surveillance. We don't know how deep it was. At first I was ticked, but then I said, you know what? That's a sign
Mhm.
that what we're doing is working. That's a sign that nothing would be more tragic
That's right.
than for us to turn back now.
Mhm. Yes, and we aren't going to turn back. We are with you. I'm ready to be there 2022 with your march. And I think, you know, we continue to need to hear your voice and the truth being told by the Poor People's Campaign, the Repairs of the Breach. Each and every individual that we show up. We did a bus tour here in California 2 years ago at the End Child Poverty Campaign. And it was the same thing, Reverend Barber, the same thing. People showed up from every walk of life, wanting to join the ranks of the movement and to really be seen and to have our leaders and policymakers do the right thing. So we thank you for leading the charge. We thank you for, you know, I know you are everywhere and you're tired sometimes, but you showed up today to give us this word of encouragement, to keep us motivated, to keep us fighting for what we know is just and right. And so thank you again for being here. And
Can I
we
get
just
three
can't.
slogans? I want your people to repeat: forward together, not one step back. Say that with me: forward together,
Forward together,
not one step back.
not one step back.
Next one is somebody
Somebody
in hurting our people.
Somebody is hurting our people.
Somebody is hurting our people.
Somebody is hurting our people.
And it's gone on far too long.
And it's gone on far too long.
And we won't be silent anymore.
And we won't be silent anymore.
And the last one is everybody in.
Everybody in.
Nobody out.
Nobody out.
That's our movement. We're not an organization. We're a movement. We don't need any more organizations. We need to coalesce around the fusion movement. So we're not, the Poor People's Campaign is not another organization. It's an organism just saying to y'all, if we do this, if we can change the narrative and build power, it will help all of us in our silos. But we've got to bring our silos together to have transformative actions that drive a new narrative and a new conversation and builds power. That's what has to happen, and we're committed to it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. God bless you. And now I'm very excited to continue our conversation with our main plenary panel. And I'm thrilled to have Celeste Fremon here today as our moderator. Celeste is an award-winning freelance journalist specializing in gangs, law enforcement, criminal justice, and education policy. She's also the founder and editor of Witness LA. Celeste, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thanks so much, Shimica. I'm just trying to stop tearing up. We have a wonderful panel here, and I want to introduce them to you. First, we have Dr. Bettina Love, who is the author of the highly praised 2020 book, We Want to Do More Than Survive, Absolutionist Teaching and the Pursuit of Educational Freedom. She's a professor at the University of Georgia who in her research coined the term abolitionist teaching, which seems like the right term to follow Reverend Barber, which is the concept of bringing the rebellious spirit and methods of abolitionists into the educational world. Hi, Dr. Love. And next we have Dr. Shawn Ginwright, who is a professor at the Africana Studies Department of San Francisco State University, where his research examines the ways in which youth in urban communities navigate through poverty and other constraints to create equality and justice in their schools and communities. He's also the chairman of the board of the California Endowment and a senior research associate at the Cesar Chavez Institute for Public Policy. By the way, on each one of these panelists, I'm doing the short version of what they do. The true version is a lot longer. Mayor Michael Tubbs is best known as having been the recent mayor of Stockton, California, elected in 2016 when he was 26 years old. He was Stockton's first African-American mayor and the youngest mayor of any major city in American history. He is also a 2021 fellow at the Harvard Institute of Politics, a member of Fortune's Top 40 Under 40, and was named the most valuable mayor by The Nation magazine. He now serves on the Commission for Police Officer Standards and Training, POST, and is a member of the National Police Foundation's Council on Policing Reforms and Race. And then Shimica Gaskins, who just spoke to you, as you know, is the executive director of the Children's Defense Club Fund California. I'm still stumbling after after Reverend Barber. In the past, she has served as the acting Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Office of Legal Policy of the U.S. Department of Justice, where she worked on such projects as prison reform, reentry, and issues affecting children with incarcerated parents. She is now also a board member for Impact Justice and a member of the LA County Commission for Children and Families. All right. So the first question goes to Dr. Love. Dr. Love, you've written about the concept of spirit murdering when it comes to children. One of the things you described in your book as spirit murdering is the effect on kids and young people when they see all the violence aimed at Black people and Indigenous people and other people of color, and that their takeaway too often is that they don't matter and that they're disposable. And you also write a lot about mattering. So how do we best counter these incredibly toxic messages with the message that each of our kids matter profoundly? And how do we bring that into the educational environment? I know that's a multi-part question.
Well, first of all, let me just say it's wonderful to be with you all. Thank you, Celeste. Dr. Ginwright, I'm such a big fan of yours. I love everything that you have written, done, said. Mayor Tubbs, the work that you have done. We are in Atlanta right now fighting for earned income. I was on that committee that you came and spoke to us to fight for earned income in Atlanta, Georgia. So I'm just delighted to be on a panel with you all today and really raise up important questions around Black children, around what it means to teach Black and brown children, what it means to love Black and brown children. So, we got a lot of work to do. And I think the one thing we have to do is restore humanity and for Black and brown children to see themselves as beautiful. And so this idea and this concept of spirit murdering comes out of the work of Patricia Williams. And the idea is that when we talk about racism in this country, we don't talk about it to its full totality. We talk about racism in data and statistics and panels and committees, right? And all that stuff is real, don't get me wrong. But what we don't say is that what happens to a child's spirit? What happens to their soul? What happens to their ideas of self when you walk into a classroom or you walk into a school and there's police and there's guns? I'm supposed to believe you trust me. I'm supposed to believe you see the best in me. I'm supposed to believe that you think that I'm important when you can put a gun to my face, when I can walk through metal detectors. So spirit murdering is about schools and how the structure of schooling, the conditions of schooling create, these conditions. And then we talk about kids as if they are these conditions, right? Children are, they're low performing. The kids aren't low performing. The system is low performing. So we got to be able to use the language that really gets at the issues that are taking place in our schools today. And so, I try to write about and have those conversations around the idea of spirit murdering that really talks about the system and what it does to young children, what it does to all of us, really, when you are faced and living in a carceral state. And the United States educational system is a carceral state.
Thank you, Dr. Love. And by the way, I just, I'm in the middle of reading and listening to this, and I can't recommend her book strongly enough.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
It's terrific. Dr. Ginwright, you differentiate between the trauma-informed approach to youth that's been popular and a healing approach, with the latter being where we need to go now. Would you explain the difference between those two and why that difference is important, and also the best way of, once again, it's a two-part question, the best way of bringing that power of healing to our schools and communities as we move forward from COVID, the events of last year, and, well, as we move forward?
Yeah. Thank you, Celeste and Shimica, and I too am a fan of Dr. Love and Mayor Tubbs. So it's an honor to be here and to just share these ideas that are so important in transforming our societies in ways that that really provide a sense, as Dr. Love talks about, of mattering and belonging. The challenge with the ways in which we've been trained, both as educators and youth development professionals, is that we believe that young people exist in a vacuum, and that we can provide educational supports and we can provide educational strategies, curriculum, and to a certain extent even pedagogy that can have a significant impact on young people. The challenge with the youth development model is that young people, it doesn't consider the ways in which that young people are suffering. They're suffering in neighborhoods, they're suffering in schools, and that suffering is largely entirely a result of white supremacist structures, poverty and racial inequality that create the conditions that make it much more difficult for young people to learn. And it makes it much more difficult to infuse love into the spaces that they needed, such as schools and youth development programs. I believe we as a society right now, coming out of the 2020, that we should just call that the do-over year, or the year of deep uncertainty. I believe that we're sitting as a society directly between trauma and transformation, that we are experiencing both, and that education and schools and those of us who work with young people are the only people that can actually move and usher our society into transformation. If we're not clear about how we engage with each other and how we engage with young people, what we will inadvertently do is bring forth or bring things into this new world, this post-COVID world that created created inequality in the first place. We have an opportunity in our classrooms and in our schools and our youth development programs to transform the ways in which we engage and work with young people. And so the healing centered model simply says that we have to have a new way and another way of engaging with young people. It's based in love, it's based in courage, it's based in belonging. It's an awareness and an understanding of the ways in which white supremacy and racism structure suffering for young people. But it is important and critically important for the adults in these systems to also take up their own healing and well-being. I was trained as a youth development professional and as a teacher. And the assumption is that as long as you're an adult and you're in front of some young people, that's a good thing. But adults ourselves have trauma. We have stuff we're dealing with. And the extent to which we can build systems that saturate all of us in communities of love and support and belonging, that is the only way we can actually begin to transform schools into places where we create the new kind of society that we envision.
It's fascinating that you bring up that if the adults aren't dealing with their own traumas, they're gonna have a much harder time dealing with the kids' traumas. Is it enough to sort of move forward? Is there a protocol that we need to think about that is specifically healing, or is sort of a different way of viewing our kids and moving forward enough? Or does there have to be an active form of healing to address the fact that there are so many kids that
I think that much of the training in schools of ed and even in youth development field, it doesn't provide the kind of adult development that's necessary to have a transformative impact on young people. If you ask any young person in this country what matters in your mentor, or what matters with your teacher, and it's that I trust them, that I have a relationship, a transformative relationship. And what we've been trained is mostly around transactional relationships. That is, I'm the teacher, you are the student, I'm the principal. you're the teacher. These are transactional relationships that are efficient, but they're not enough for transformation. And so we need transformative relationships. And those are relationships that are built on, they're built on our ability to be human with each other. When we share vulnerability, when we share empathy, right? And we're not trained to do that, right? And so it's important that we build spaces and time for reflection for teachers to deal with their own racial bias, to begin to create ways to cultivate those kind of relationships with young people.
That's great. So, Mayor Tubbs, when you were the mayor of Stockton, you famously launched a pilot program that gave 125 randomly selected low-income residents $500 a month of guaranteed income for 2 years with no strings attached. And at the time, this was a completely radical idea. And, you know, I mean, now we're working, going through the Congress, we have something that, you know, I mean, it's now a given that we really need to give no strings attached money to people when Americans. So, and it's going to benefit the whole culture. And you got a lot of criticism, but now, of course, we know in the last couple of days, the results of an independent study on the project showed that in the first year, full-time employment among this 125 people in the pilot project rose significantly among those who had the guaranteed income. I mean, significantly, not a little bit. They paid off debt, they got full-time jobs, and reported lower rates of anxiety and depression, according to the study that was released Wednesday. It was very nice timing for our panel, I thought. So what ideally do you want the takeaway to be from the results of your pilot program when it comes to helping children and families who need it the most?
Well, first, let me also join the fan club adoration and say thank you to the doctors. Dr. Ginwright, I wrote my entire thesis from college based off your work around youth participatory action research about toxicity in schools. And Dr. Love, I'm a big fan. And I think as a former educator, if your book had come out 6 years ago, I would have been even more effective in my classroom. And then Shimica knows I'm a CDF baby. I'm a CDF fan. I'm so grateful for her leadership and her work, the work of the organization, and my mentor, Ms. Edelman. And to answer your question, I think the studies speaks to a couple of issues, I think, are my takeaways. Number one, data isn't the problem because the data in this case was convincing, overwhelming. People were doubly more likely to work from part-time to full-time, receiving guaranteed income than not. People were healthier. We saw cortisol levels and stress and anxiety go down even more significantly than clinical trials of Prozac. We saw people saying they're able to show up and be parents. I could read to my kids, people said. I could help them with their homework. I could get them on Zoom. I could say yes instead of no. I was able to be fully human. And yet I don't see any legislation. I don't see anything moving forward to act on what we've seen, not just in this study, but literally in studies across this world around this idea of providing income floor for people. And I think that speaks to the heart of this panel. The issue is narrative, that in this country, we have a very difficult conversation that we have to keep having about who deserves and what do we deserve, right? Because for me, a guaranteed income really speaks to notions of inherent dignity, that we all have dignity that's not attached to our jobs, but actually attached to our humanity. Because if dignity was truly attached to work, people wouldn't work in such undignified conditions, right? I think, so that's part of the issue. I think we also have to grapple with legacies of white supremacy and how they color who we trust. We just gave $2 trillion in tax cuts in 2017 to the wealthiest among us. I've had more questions asked about what my 125 people did in my small city with philanthropic dollars not tax dollars, had it audited, questioned, critiqued, have to explain it, more so than the $2 trillion we gave from our money, from our taxes to the wealthy and to the richest. So to answer your question, the takeaway for me is that we know that government at its best allows parents to be parents, right? And that looks like a whole slate of policies that allow folks to stay at home, that allow folks to have affordable childcare, that allow folks to have like an income floor. And we also know that we have work to do to get there. So we have to continue to be bold and courageous and challenge racist tropes. We have to lean into a feminist economy, an economy that actually values the unpaid contributions of women in terms of child rearing and domestic labor, and also the paid contributions. And we have to demand, particularly in this moment, as the Reverend said, that we build back better, that we have a very special opportunity to illustrate, particularly because more of the kids in this next generation are gonna look like this panel than previous generations. And we have to make sure we're making the right investments, just like 50 plus years ago when the American government was giving land to people, or some people, and giving low interest loans to some people. We have to have that same level of investment in the 21st century. And I think that's literally the only way forward in terms of survival as a country.
Thank you. I was so glad to see those studies come out, that study to come out today.
Me too. Everyone keeps saying people aren't going to work. You can't tell me anything. I have an attitude now because the data says.
Well, I know. Well, I mean, you knew it and you were seeing it in real time. And obviously this is something that you felt was really important. And I remember it was proposed. It just seemed remarkable and courageous and amazing. But now we've got data, you know, and it matters. Shimica, in the new book, Some of Us by Heather McGee, she talks about how a zero-sum perspective affects much of our public policy, particularly when it comes to systemic racism. And which felt like, you know, I mean, that addressed the pilot too. It's like, we can't give people, you know, even though it came, as you said, it came from Mayor Tubbs, it came from, you know, it came from donors. It took, anyway, it's just, I'm going to stop ranting. So how do we, Shimica, how do we counter that perspective when it comes to youth, and how can we move policy in the national dialogue away from zero sum and toward interdependence? Because we're just seeing that zero sum perspective everywhere. And it's, you know, the damage is extraordinary. And it's just, it's, you know, and nobody benefits.
Yeah, well, first, I'm going to also take a moment of personal privilege and just thank Dr. Love, Dr. Ginwright, and my friend Michael for being here, and you, Celeste, for joining us for this conversation. You know, I think, you know, zero sum really is this idea that progress, liberation for some of us is going to come at the expense of others, right? And as Heather talks about in her book, you know, it's really the root, is what Michael was also pointing out, of the dysfunction in our country, right? Because we know that racism is in all aspects of our society, and it accelerates inequality for all of us. And how this plays out in our public policy for our youth is when we enact policies that are really meant to be, you know, progressive or equitable. Like here in California, we have the local control funding formula that specifically is a promise of equity for low-income children, foster youth, English language learners. But what we see what happens after it is enacted is that parents, students, organizations still have to fight for those dollars to specifically support the very people it was intended to go to. And so you have to ask yourself, well, why does that happen? And it's because zero sum begins to seep in to all corners of our society. It begins to make, that's why you can make decisions around general funding instead of funding specifically to support the children that need it the most. And I was reminded of, as we were talking and thinking about this question of zero sum, you know, I had the privilege to visit Finland and Norway about a year ago, 2019, to visit their prisons, to learn about the changes they had made to their criminal justice system, specifically for youth. And as we were touring a Norwegian prison called Halden, and it's a prison that's been touted as one of the most humane prisons in the world now. It's a maximum secure prison, but there, the inmates showed us their high-tech classrooms, their art rooms that had painting, music, sculpting, the culinary school that allowed them to learn how to cook and work in restaurants, and the grocery store where they could purchase fresh food and then go back and cook it for themselves in their dormitory living. And as we were walking through, we met a Black immigrant. And I was really excited to talk to him because I wanted to hear what his experiences were in this prison, right? And as we were talking, the thing that he said to me that stuck with me the most, that has kept me moving forward, was, yeah, it's better in here than some of your American schools. And I was crushed for a number of reasons. But as I thought about it over and over again, two things stood out. One, it's not all of our American schools. It's the schools that tend to have our Black, brown, poor youth. And two, the Norwegian prisons are not by far the most perfect, but they made a choice to change. They made a choice to invest in the prisoners that were there, the inmates, the people who they call by their names, not by numbers, to be better when they leave, because they knew that bettering them there was going to be better for their whole society. So they have really flipped the whole script on the zero-sum mentality. And it just happened. They haven't been doing this for decades. And so it said to me that we have a political will, we could do it too. And it even more so is needed for our young people. And so that's why we have to keep fighting, and we have to keep pushing, and we have to push for things like the inclusion of our immigrant brothers and sisters here in California into our social safety net programs, into our healthcare, into our tax system, because we have almost 50% of children in California are in mixed status households. And so, as Reverend Barber said, if the pandemic has taught us anything, it is that we are all independent upon each other to move our economy and to move our society to a better place.
Thanks, Shimica. When you told me about going to Norway, I envy you because I've been wanting to see their system too, but we usually talk about it as it relates to our incredibly destructive American prison system, but that your insight was, this is better than what our schools have. It's just, it's a staggering truth. And I mean, obviously better than, it offers stuff that we would never see in our juvenile halls, or in our soon, hopefully, not soon enough going to be shut down Department of Juvenile Justice, our youth prison system, that we would never tell our kids they matter that much in those facilities. Okay, round two. And you guys, I feel it's a great privilege to get to be part of this panel and get to moderate. I get to be among superstars, so I'm grateful. Dr. Love, so you've mentioned the importance of restorative justice in education. And, I'm very familiar with restorative justice and the value of restorative justice. And, I've heard a little bit about it in education, but what are the steps? Give us an example of restorative justice in teaching and in schools, and why it's important. That in that context.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of different models of restorative justice, and I think there's some ways we get it right and some ways we get it wrong. I just want to just go back to that narrative that Shimica just gave. It was just so beautiful. The storytelling that you was just so beautiful, and the work that you all do is just it's what's necessary. It's restorative. I think so much when we think about restorative justice. Many kids will tell you restorative justice means I'm in the hot seat. I sit there and everybody tells me what I did wrong and how I need to restore the justice. But when we think about restorative justice, it's about a community. It's about everyone. It's just that old proverb, like it takes a village, and we see everybody, and everybody's responsible not only for that child, but for the justice in that community. But I think I think Dr. Ginwright can answer this question much better than me. But what I think more than anything is, we just got to get to the truth. And the truth is that we don't value Black life. Like, we just got to get to the truth. Like, the truth is that, when we say what other countries do and what happens in other places, they value human life. They value it as people who are incarcerated, as people who have committed a crime. On January 6th, why didn't they arrest those people? Because they didn't see criminals. We saw violent behavior, but they didn't see criminals. Those police officers like, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? Now, you know what to do in the hood. Why didn't you know what to do right there? And so much about our schooling, like, we can't get to restorative until we start to see people as human beings, until we start to see our children as human beings, that we believe that they're worthy. And if you believe somebody is worthy, you will invest in them. If you believe somebody is worthy, you will put your money there. You will put your goals there. You will put your dreams there if you believe that somebody is worthy. And also, when you believe that somebody is worthy, then you believe that their goodness and their fortune and what happens to them in their life actually impacts yours when you believe somebody is worthy.
And their goodness is a given.
Right. And their dignity is a given. So the fundamental problem is, it's so, we talk about racism so much, but we don't talk about anti-Blackness, and so much about our educational system. It's just anti-Black. They don't see us as human. Anti-Blackness is a disregard for you, a disdain for you. And if I do see you as human, it is something to criminalize. And so we can't move until restorative justice, until we see Black people's communities and children and goals and dreams as worthy, as beautiful, as special, as something that betters humanity. I mean, when we talk about Black people in this country, we don't talk about them as the makers of democracy, as the people who have given so much, have created so much and done so much and loved so much. Marcus Garvey called us a mighty people for a reason. Who keeps loving and fighting like we do? Who keeps getting up like we do? You think about what we fought for in this country. To go to the pool on a nice summer day and have a nice dip in the pool, to eat at the lunch counter, to have a drink of water from the water fountain. You think what Black folks have fought for in this country. And what we don't talk about is that we sent our babies in there to do it. We sent our babies into these schools to try to tell these folks that we were worthy. Think of Ruby Bridges. Ruby Bridges is only 66 years old. That's it. Ruby Bridges is not 95, 100 years old. She is 66 years old. What happened was 60 years ago, and the skeleton is still there today. So, the problem with restorative justice is a tool that we could use, because we need to replace zero tolerance in schools. We need to replace what Miriam Kaba and Erica Miner call a carceral logic. That's what we have in school, a carceral logic, which means everything has to do with Black and brown children is about punishment. That's the solution. Punishment, punishment, punishment. And it happens in many, many forms, but it's a carceral logic. And so we can't get to restorative, we can't get to any of that until you see the goodness and the beauty in the Black people. And so Dr. King said it best. I'm not going to get it 100% right, but Dr. King said, listen. He probably didn't say listen. He said, listen. I'm gonna put that in there. He said, listen and yo, I'm gonna put my whole New York spin on it, right? Dr. King says, policies will not stop the heartless, but they will stop the heartless, right? Policies can't change hearts and minds. We understand that, but it will stop the heartless. And so what we need are policies that will stop the heartless, because they don't see us as human. They don't see us as real. They don't see us as beautiful. And we are fighting an uphill battle. And so we're going to try and change hearts and minds. We're going to try and bring in restorative justice. We're going to try and bring in all those things to help folks see us as human. Yes, that is the job. But the second job is for policy changes. And the problem, as Shimica just talked about in California, is that when we have policy changes that tinker with the edges of reform, white folks flip the script. They're going to find a way to get that money. So that's why the ideas of abolition is so important, because as long as we tinker with the edges of injustice, as long as we tinker with the edges called reform, and we don't go after the system, they will find a way. They will find a way. You know, I was speaking with a futurist a few days ago, and they said it best. They said, if you're not there at the beginning of the design, when the thing is turned on, you will be left out. You have to be there from the beginning of the design. We were not there from the beginning of the design of education. So when you turn it on, this is the result you will get when you're not there from the beginning. When they didn't think about you in the beginning, didn't even know you would be here, didn't care that you would be here. So what we are trying to do is keep tinkering with a machine that was never meant to turn on for us. Turn it off and let's build something and have us be there from the very beginning. And then you can put restorative justice in schools. That's automatic. That's not a side piece on the side of it. It's from the roots of it. And so it's what Ella Baker said and what Angela Davis said, go to the root. Don't go around it. Don't go between it. Go to the root. Go to the root of oppression. And too often we look at the conditions of oppression and we don't ask ourselves, who created the conditions? We look at the people trying to survive the conditions, never go into the root of the people who did the conditions.
So
and we always
just look just at the symptoms.
Yeah, we always looking at always. And that is the busy work of oppression. You know, Toni Morrison said racism is distraction.
Thanks, Dr. Love. Dr. Ginwright?
I'm just letting this sit right now. Like,
right?
Let the church say, the church say amen.
Amen.
Like, you can shut this panel down
Amen.
right now, because enough has been said. I mean, come on.
You know, thanks for
that.
Pause.
Yeah. Can I just say something?
Please.
I'm just, full. I mean, that's truth speaking, right? And, Bettina, I think that sometimes what oppression does to us, for those of us who love justice, is that it limits and shapes our imagination, so that sometimes even when we are at the place to design a new thing, the most courageous act that we can do is deconstruct and tinker around the edges of the thing that we want to transform. And so what I tell my students, my graduate students, is the most insidious consequence of oppression, the worst part of oppression, is that it destroys our capacity to dream beyond it. And as a result of that, all we do is tinker at the thing that creates our suffering. And sometimes we can't even see beyond it. And now we need to address it. I'm not saying we should not address it, but we also have to cultivate an imagination. If Africans who were enslaved didn't dream about freedom, Africans would have wanted an easier form of slavery, but they dreamed of freedom. And so this notion of imagination and what you're talking about being able to to be at the table, to create the new thing, the new system, the new institution is critically important as we move into transforming and creating the new world that's right before us. If we're not thinking about the new system, the new institutions, and we're just trying to sit here and fix what we got, we're going to be having the same conversation in 20 years, right? So anyway, I'm gonna stand back, Celeste, and let you ask the question.
Hell yeah, that's all I had to say.
Well, but there's so much of your work that addresses exactly that. You know, my mind split, like your flourish incorporation. But that's not what I was going to ask you about. When it comes to healing, you and civil rights attorney Brian Stevenson talk about the importance of reconciliation. What are the steps in that? What do we need to do with regard to reconciliation right now? What are the steps we can take, or how can we flip that script to the point where it's really clear that we have to have that? We have to, it's otherwise, you know, the nation, you know, it's like going to therapy without ever talking about all the wounds and what happened and what was done.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm writing a book right now, just finishing a book where I'm really wrestling with and being very vulnerable in this book about the concept of belonging.
By the way, we tried to weasel out details of your book from your friend Deb that came and met with us, and she was very good. She went, no, can't say anything.
Oh, she could say anything.
But just so you know, if you know, we know there is a book happening. But anyway,
yeah, the book is called The Four Pivots, and it's about these 4 pivots that we need to make as a society and as individuals to actually create the new transformation of a society that we want. And so one of the concepts I'm wrestling with is this notion of belonging. A good friend, you guys may know Pastor Ben McBride. He says, Mayor Tubbs, you know probably this quote he always says is the first wrong question we ask is what do we need to do? The first right question we should be asking is who do we need to become? And it is that notion of sitting in our humanity and seeing each other as human that is the first step of creating the kind of systems and policies that are necessary. If we don't see each other as human, how can we create inclusion? How do we create systems of mattering? We can't do it if we don't see each other as human. So this chapter I wrote was probably the most difficult thing I've ever written, because if I believe in belonging and mattering, then I have to see someone that I vehemently disagree with is still human. Mm-hmm. Now follow me, y'all. So I'm not going to get into the details of the chapter, but turns out that there's a white nationalist supremacist that contacted me about an article I wrote. I knew him from high school, and so about 6 months, I was like, I just blocked him. And my wife, my couple of friends said, you need to interview him for your book. And so I did. It was the most difficult thing I've had to do. We disagreed on everything. Turns out that he was dealing with a loss of a child, baby. He was going through a lot of stuff. And my point is that at some point in the interview, he became human. He became human because he was dealing with the death of a child, right? And it was that conversation that allowed us to, at least for a moment, to have some sense of human connection. Nothing else he said I agreed with. We disagreed vehemently with everything. It was a difficult interview. But my point is that for those of us who are trying to create that sense of inclusion, mattering, and belonging, we have to practice the tough work as well as those who don't see me as human. Y'all follow me? And this is what we've learned from South Africa Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the Truth and Reconciliation in the Native communities in Canada, right? That there's a space of possibility that we have to step into in this country that allows us to have different kind of conversations. It doesn't mean I'm going to agree with you, but the ultimate goal is to see each other as human. And without doing that, we will continue to reproduce these systems that dehumanize and create suffering, right? And I'm not saying that South Africa is perfect. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that Canada is perfect. What I'm saying is that there's an example of a space that was created in the Truth and Reconciliation that allowed for people to be human with each other. That's it. And that possibility, when we create that possibility, there's new things that can come from that.
You know, as you're saying that, I think that in the end is the answer to the zero-sum problem. Not an easy one, but whenever I'm enraged at some, you know, the people in our culture that are just doing dreadful and damaging things, my friend Father Greg Boyle says, no, you know, they're in a lot of pain. And I know that intellectually, but thanks for that. Thanks for that. Mayor Tubbs, you've talked recently to the Columbia Journalism Review about how you and your programs were the objects of aggressive misinformation campaign by the local free publication, which had a vendetta. And lately there seems to be a lot of misinformation. It's running rife through the countryside and doing great damage. So what did you learn from your experience, and how in general does misinformation affect our youth policy? And now it's a three-part question, and based on your experience, how can that misinformation be countered for our youth and for, I mean, you dealt with it up close, and I mean, reading about that just was staggering. You know, that it was happening right here in Stockton because we're seeing it everywhere. So now you're the expert.
Yeah.
Looking to you for answers.
Well, I think so disinformation isn't new as a concept. Like the whole lie of white supremacy is the ultimate disinformation operation. Racism is a centuries-long disinformation campaign. So what's different is now there's tools that capture attention and feeds to the distraction that Toni Morrison talked to. And I say that because if you look at sort of the Stockton disinformation, it was all root. They didn't make up new racist tropes. They just grounded it in deep anti-Blackness and racism. What do I mean? For 4 years, every single day, 3 times a day, manipulating the Facebook algorithm, there were one of 3 stories. Number 1, Michael Tubbs is spending money or stealing money, i.e., Black people are criminal. So without any evidence, without even as much as an accusation, without as much as a fine. Hell, I left office with a $13 million surplus in the pandemic after coming in as a council member when we were bankrupt. But the lie tethered to racism became reality for people. The second lie they would say was that Michael Tubbs is always on vacation. Michael Tubbs is never working, because if I dare to take a picture of me and my friends being joyful, it was taken as an affront. Because I think another big part of racism is dehumanization. And it's not just sort of how folks see us, but how we see ourselves. And I made a very conscious effort after about a month of trying to be a perfect robot that I'm going to live. I'm 27 years old. So on the weekend, I'm not going to be worried about what's happening. I'm going to deal with on Monday. I'm going to have fun with my friends. I'm going to be happy. I love my beautiful wife. I love my son. We're going to be happy and joyful, despite the fact that everything's not happy and joyful. And I did that very intentionally to really show that, no, I can be fully human, right? And then the third big lie was this idea that ties to the first one, that Michael Tubbs is somehow corrupt. But part of it was just kind of delegitimizing the fact that a Black person, much less a Black person with a father who's incarcerated, much less a Black person whose father's incarcerated, whose mother had him as a teenager, who's also openly Black and not afraid to talk about being Black, there's no way he can legitimately be the mayor of the city, particularly because the city had never had a Black mayor since inception. And I mean, I saw it and intellectually I got it, but I didn't think it would work. So I think part of it was my naivety. I just thought reality, optics, facts, real news, real journalism, real stories will play out. And then I think the other thing that's been super informative for me, and I think this is a good note for folks who aspire to particularly political leadership. I think it's a couple things. It's that number one, the status quo has a lot of friends, and a lot of friends you may not ever meet. So if you are actually effective, because we didn't just do a basic income, we reduced homicides by 40% by centering on the humanity of the folks who are most likely to be victims and perpetrators, by saying we need to give folks resources and opportunities. We didn't just do basic income, we provided a scholarship to every single student in our largest, most predominantly minority school district for the next 10 years, saying that we expect you to go to a trade school, community college, or college. We didn't just do basic income, we also ended the golf subsidy. We also prioritized equity. We also talked about the need to reverse red lines. We're doing all those things, and all those things sound good on Twitter and sound good on panels, but in the rest of a society still that voted for Donald Trump, those things are radical and actually push against notions of superiority and notions about the status quo and how it works. So if I was to do anything differently, I would have came in with the same level of focus on kind of counterattacking as I did on just doing work, because my whole orientation was, let's just get some wins on the board and everything else will take care of itself. And people be mad, people be upset, but we're effective. And I realize now that no, our country's the way it is because there's powerful vested interest and powerful vested ideologies. And again, I think, particularly in a community like Stockton, which has some of the worst outcomes for Black people in this entire state, if not the nation, that even the idea of someone 26 years old from the worst part of the city being mayor was threatening. And there was a deliberate attempt to discredit that. So I'm thankful that the work continues. I'm thankful that I'm wiser now about disinformation. But I think for me, it's also just letting my folks know that disinformation isn't new. Our society is built on disinformation about who's deserving and who's not. What's new is that now Facebook and social media feed that poison to you every day. And again, the last thing I'll say is, because people are like, well, why didn't you do something? If it was a year-long or even a campaign thing, it would have been fine. I mean, I won 4 campaigns before that, all by 20 points somewhere. Like, I know how to run a political campaign. This was a 4-year, 3 times a day psychological operation executed by former Marines who literally spent time thinking about sort of how do we do a psych ops on the people of Stockton, their words in press. And I just didn't have the range yet to deal with that. But a couple months later, I'm a little bit better now. So I'm looking forward to next steps and spending some time countering disinformation and still delivering for our people because we deserve it.
Thanks for talking about that. It's just so important. And anyway, I'm glad you're there and I'm glad you did the work you did and look forward to all the next steps. Shimica. And speaking of next steps, the inevitable next steps question. What do we need to be on the lookout for in this next year to achieve radical transformation, or to put it another way, looking ahead to healing our kids, helping them flourish? What worries you the most? And what should we all be doing to help build back better and looking through the lens of radical transformation?
Oh, well,
What now?
I know. I mean, I've been a student here this morning, and I think, you know, it's hard for me not to say Mayor Tubbs. But, you know, I think this is why we so strongly get behind people who are willing to be courageous. And that is what he did and does. That's what Bettina does in her writing. That's what Dr. Ginwright does. And so to try and make it more specific, you know, I think what currently kind of worries me specifically for California is, and Reverend Barber touched on this, is just our, you know, we're the 5th largest economy. This year, we were projecting a deficit. We ended up with a $26 billion, I think, windfall. But we are projecting over the next 3 years, a $17 billion deficit. And so you have this, again, this back and forth where we have to continue to push and fight for the investments that we know will be needed, not just today when we have $26 billion, but the year after and the year after. And when you think of what typically comes up, as Michael was saying, is austerity. Well, now the government is going to have to cut. And who are they going to cut first? Well, it's the programs that affect our communities, our children. And so for me, that's what I'm watching and hoping that we can continue to build solidarity around, pushing back against. You know, we have had radically reimagined our youth justice system here in California. We've made great strides, but there's still so much work to do. And we've seen even in our own backyard here with a new DA who's pledged to do right by children and treat them as youth, that there's unprecedented pushback.
Oh, the attacks are just extraordinary.
And so, you know, we have to continue to stay vigilant and watching and coming together. And I think what I hope most people are taking away from today is that what we've all talked about really isn't that radical, as Reverend Barber said. It's not that radical for everybody to have enough, right? Especially in California. And it's not that radical for our children to be adequately educated, for them to have safe places to play, for their parents to have a living wage, and, you know, and for our youth to be treated and allowed to make mistakes that don't condemn them and diminish their trajectory for the rest of their life. And let them be the amazing young people we know they are meant to be. And so that's what I'm watching for. That's what I'm hoping that we continue to come together. There's so many people. CDF doesn't do anything alone. We are part of coalitions with other organizations, parents, youth. And so I just want us to continue to push together and stay watchful.
It's where we need to go, and thank you for laying it out. Bettina, Shawn, Michael, Shimica, you are heroes, and I feel blessed to be sitting with you today. Thanks so much for all of this. We could have done it at twice the time.
Thank you, Celeste.
Thank you, Celeste. It was so good to be on a panel with you all. Just amazing. And I learned so much. I'm inspired. Thank y'all so much. Thank you.
That was church. Thank you. I'm gonna tune in on Sunday. I said church on Friday.
I know. I'm inspired and teary. Ongoing teariness. It's pathetic.
Oh, no, it's all love.
Thanks so much, everybody. Take care of yourselves. All right. Be safe.
All right.
Goodbye.
Good morning, all. My name is Saida Soto. I'm the Deputy Executive Director for the Children's Defense Fund in California. And we are waiting for our Superintendent of Instruction, Tony Thurmond, to join us. So while that happens, I'm going to, is the superintendent on? While we wait for him to join us, I would like to ask that we share a video from our Children's Defense and Freedom Schools, which is hosted in at the Altadena, in the Altadena community. So if you give us a second to share that with you.
I want peace on my block so I can walk to the store. I don't wanna have to hear no gunshots no more.
I'm allergic to the trash. Let's get past all the violence. They want me to stay quiet, but I won't stay silent. They won't believe a child, so I'm coming with the stats. Every 234, one more, that's facts. Too many to name. Yo, it's such a shame. I'm calling out the shooters from the police to the gangs.
We don't want no smoke. Oh, yeah. Tell them we don't want no smoke.
I take you to the White House. These cannons out here wildin' out, but I can't shut my mouth about what's affecting my house.
Put us over guns, we can't rest until it's done. Till our babies being killed equate to white mother sons.
Too much hate that fill the news. They shooting up the schools. Country mixed with WAP, but they giving me the blues. Family fire lethal, to me it seems evil. Okay. Protecting all the triggers, but not thinking about the people. Okay.
Oh, yeah. We don't want no smoke. Oh, yeah. Tell them we don't want no smoke.
My name is Lil Z, aka Baby Blaze. Pasadena was the place I was raised. I came to Freedom School just to spend my summer days. But I can make a change. Let's start off with a policy. I'm tired of apologies. Dreams are getting killed, but success will come and follow me.
Freedom School's a movement. Who ready to go? He don't want no, she don't want no, we don't want no smoke.
That was beautiful. Thank you to our partner, Pasadena Learns, in the producers of this video. Now, again, thank you and welcome everyone. Again, I'm Zaida Soto. I'm the Deputy Executive Director for the Children's Defense Fund in California. Superintendent Tony Thurmond is running behind schedule, so we are going to move up our next plenary. And so for that, I'd like to welcome Christina Altmayer, who is the Senior Vice President of the Center for Child and Family Impact at First Five. Christina will be moderating our next plenary entitled Back to School, Healing Anti-Racism and Equity After COVID-19. Thank you so much, Christina. Thank you for being with us today.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. Very excited to lead this panel and to be part of this incredibly important discussion. That video was quite powerful. So I'm very excited to moderate this panel. We have 3 guests. Thank you so much. Really incredible guests that will be engaging in this discussion with us as we think about moving from the pandemic into the future state. And I think we all are committed to building back better and the lessons that have learned from this experience, which have really highlighted the incredible disparities that we know that exist between children of color and families of color. And they have been the most impacted by COVID. But moving forward, our health and education systems really need to work together. And I think, we know, as many of you do, that the disparities that exist begin prior to birth and they continue throughout life. One of the things that, as First 5 LA has been monitoring the impact of COVID on families, we know that they are disproportionately impacted by COVID, have less access to the vaccines. And if we want to support children, we really need to support their families. And as I said, disparities exist before birth. We know that birth outcomes are significantly poorer for African American, and that is despite access to insurance, despite economic status, and that those disparities that begin at birth continue through lifespan, as we see that COVID has changed the lifespan projection, and that lifespan projection, again, has disproportionately impacted families of color. So what we want to talk about this morning is recognizing this, is the connection between health outcomes of the child and health outcomes of the family, that interconnectedness. And we want to speak about how we can move forward in building the connections between our health systems and our educational systems. And I'm so thrilled that we have 3 speakers with us today. Dr. Sylvia Rousseau, who's the retired professor of clinical education at USC. Dr. Kanwarpal Dhaliwal is also here, the co-founder of the RISE Center in Northern California, and Angelica Salazar for the Director of Education Equity at Children's Defense Fund. So their formal bios are listed and available in the program. But what we really want to get started with is jumping right in. So good morning and welcome to Dr. Rousseau. And I believe you're going to start us with this conversation around how do we think about coming back to school.
So can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, good. That was my big concern. All right, I'm really pleased to be a part of this panel. I commend CDF for putting it on. It's right on target. It's about building partnerships and influences, all of the influences on a child's life and how we come together. So I do have a slide presentation just to keep us focused. And so, so if you have, yeah. There we are. So we'll just keep moving. So the next slide, please. So I created this in some of the work I'm doing because equity is absolutely has to be the language of the day. But my concern is that equity can be transactional with whomever we're dealing. But to be transformative, equity always has to be spoken of in the context of equality, because we know that these inequities continue. Next slide. These inequities continue because we are still living in a system, in a country, in a nation that is based on the lie. And that original lie, that birth defect of our nation was that some people are more equal than others. So we always have to remind that so that we don't just have people handing out things, they think they're giving us something. We must highlight the equality of all human beings. And I put this slide up too because there's something to celebrate here. We can say that the Los Angeles Unified School District provided 108 million meals and 5,000 COVID vaccines, and that's something to celebrate. But the flaw is implied in this slide, because none of us had to guess which communities those 108 million meals had to be passed out to. and and conducting the COVID, giving some access. We know that it occurred in communities that have been disenfranchised, marginalized, etc. So on the one hand, we have this habit of America of doing well with charity, giving something as if they're giving something to us. But at the same time, a more fundamental job of Superintendent Austin Buettner is to disrupt, unravel the many, many ways that schools in the 200 plus years that we have had a nation have disenfranchised and created the circumstances that these families were in. The next slide. So so I think this equality of human beings has to be a theme that has to be resurrected over and over again so that people don't end up substituting what they think are charitable acts versus what our humanity deserves. And one way, I'm not going to take long on this, but Maslow tried to help us in some ways in saying that we're all our humanity, we're equal, we have common needs, and when those needs are met, we have certain outcomes that are somewhat predictable. So this is imperfect, but when you look at this bottom rung of Maslow's hierarchy, it says these are essentials to every human being in this physiological, to breathe in fresh air, to have adequate food, to have clean water. And yet these are the very fundamental things that all human beings need, but all human beings do not have. And then all human beings need family and security and employment. But if we go to this next slide, we'll see that this next slide will that someone intervened early in this nation and before this nation was formed to say that those fundamental rights were only equitably and equally distributed based upon this, that you had to merit it by being born other than people of color. So if you look at the very bottom rung of this, African Americans and all the way up this pyramid, what you see at the top is that the rights only accrue to people if you're born, what it said at this early stage in the development of the Americas, phenotypically born in Spain. And so we have this system, next slide please, this whole system of things that have become so embedded in our educational systems that they keep repeating themselves. Bourdieu says schools and schooling are probably the most important agents for continuing a social order that discriminates. And these systems are so embedded in our society that they're normalized and we don't even see them. They're imperceptible. And many times we who think we're doing good and that we're doing the right things, and I as a principal, superintendent, professor, many times they're so embedded and imperceptible that we end up fueling them and perpetuating them ourselves. Next slide. So this is just a quick slide. You can move from it, take a look real fast. We're in this treadmill. And so one of the first things that I think that we're trying to talk about solutions as well as the problem. Solutions is that there is a whole narrative about people of color, African Americans, Latinx, people, indigenous people. There's a whole narrative that we have to watch we don't participate in. That when we only talk about, particularly in our educational system, graduation rates as numbers, or hunger as numbers, or suspension rates, or unemployment. If we talk about them this way, we are in some ways, without calling people to equality, we are participating in a narrative that doesn't fall well on the ears of people who already have this disposition. They only take this as further evidence that people of color are inferior, that there's a white supremacy. Next slide. So I'm suggesting that one of the first things we need to do as we address this is change take charge of the narrative, change the narrative, and unashamedly, unapologetically. And these are just some sample things. This nation has to be reminded its whole economy is based on the labor of people of color. That we have to remind them of, why did I have to go to a movie to see Hidden Figures? That we have to intentionally, deliberately lift up and put in the face of this nation the physical and intellectual capital and assets that we've brought to this nation and that they depend on. And we have to intentionally screen textbooks and all the images. We just have to be united and partnering wherever we sit to lift up these things to this nation, to remind them that it's not charity we're asking for. These are our equal rights and we've paid our dues. Next slide. And so you can just, I've said that, so we'll go to the next slide quickly. I'm trying to stay in my 10 minutes. So I think that as a superintendent, what became clear to me is that I start looking at, this is the way we have done education. And so, yes, it was wonderful, LAUSD, to pass out that many free meals. It was an obligation and it deserves credit. But the deeper work is how has schools contributed to those circumstances in the same communities year after year, decade after decade. And so as a superintendent, when I was a superintendent and a principal, I start looking to say that this is the way schools are organized. And these two yellow things, the dark yellow, say that schools say, this is what we are in the center. And so all of you other people, if you're not white middle class and if you're not English only speakers, you don't belong. This is the way we do schools. You got to get with it. You got to try to be like these. Otherwise, you are excluded. And so that's the silent narrative and that this false meritocracy. So let's keep moving. So in the next slide, the reason we have to change this narrative is that when we only speak in deficit terms about people who have been disenfranchised and marginalized, it gets inside our children. And this notion of being incompetent and lazy and these images, and it destroys our children's spirit, their humanity. It robs them. And not only does it rob the victim of these lies and narratives, but it also dehumanizes those who have privilege so that they think they have privilege and it's their right and they can't understand why we're demanding something else. Move. Gotta keep moving fast. So that's a quick one. Look at it. We are trying to reclaim our humanity. I think that's our work. Let's keep moving quickly. We're going to slip this slide. So this is the model of schooling that we have to adopt. This is the adopt, and this is what I teach and preach and what we work on, that in the center has to be the children. The children, that's who has to be at the center of this. And all these other things in the orbit around it that we do in school have to be shaped with this child in mind. Next slide. And so this is a statement that I have carved and I keep working on people. In a democratic society, there is no real choice. We've done choice, alternatives, everything else except confront the real issue. But in a democratic society, there's no real choice unless every child has in his or her own neighborhood a quality school that meets the standards that all other schools are called to. Let's move forward. So it's up to us to end this institutional oppression. And so my second point is taking charge. First point is taking charge of the narrative. Second, okay, and my time is up, except I want to say at the end here that I am an advocate of community schools that reposition schools in communities. And if you can just skip to that slide that had Bronfenbrenner, this is what we must become, that we are a part of this system. And the extent to which we work together as a village, that's what it means to embrace the whole child and not just equity, but equality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rousseau. That was very important, both understanding the context in which we consider these changes and the pervasiveness of this, of how these influences both the child's experience and the family's experience. And I think ending on this point of the importance of community schools, I completely resonate with your vision of Dr. Bruffenbrenner's visual at the end. I know it was just popped up first for a moment there, but it shows the connection between family success embedded within the communities and child success inexplicably linked to family success and family within community. I think, sometimes think about the child. I often use this analogy. We act as if the 3-year-old walks into the pediatrician's office on their own, or that, we have to recognize about the inherent connection between family success and child success, which is why I'm so excited to, building off of the comments that you made, introduce our next speaker to speak about the work that Kanwarpal has done in really connecting schools and families together and viewing this as an integral link. So thank you so much for your opening comments, Dr. Rousseau. And I do, before I turn it over, I just want to invite everyone, please, if you have questions or comments, please post them in the chat, and we will have time at the end for questions, and we'll start to gather and fill and synthesize those questions for our panelists. So thank you all.
Thank you. I have to tell you, I usually, when I sort of present, I try to stand up, in this Zoom world, trying to like make sure I'm moving around. And I realized just being able to be in this space this morning, I needed to sit with the truth, the love, the pain, the fortitude, the relentlessness. And so I was like, I gotta sit down. So just really taking in all that's been shared and offered and given to us with such grace. And Dr. Rousseau, that I'm going right after you. I'm shaking in appreciation and indignation for the world that we're in and that we have to do this work. But also I'm really here, I'm holding close gratitude and graciousness that I get to be a part of and represent a community and an organization that really was born out of Black and brown and minoritized young people taking the risks, calling adults out for the ways in which we harm, also calling out the ways in which they see that we're traumatized and stressed out and that we need to take care of each other, but really saying, we need you to show up for us the way that we expect you to. So I am here in all of that. And so I'm with the Rise Center in Richmond, California. I think there's some folks from Richmond, the Bay. So hello to everybody. And I'm gonna actually talk a little bit about the ways in which we've really organized our sort of work as an organization to center relationships, to center healing, and to really make sure that healing must be grounded in racial justice and social justice. That healing is political, as Dr. Ginwright has told us over and over again. It is political as much as it is clinical, relational, et cetera. And for young people in our community, they have told us over and over and over again, the distress they experience is atmospheric, that it is structural, it is historical, it is political, it is in their schools, it is in their health systems, and that no matter what system they're a part of, they are policed and surveilled and treated as criminal and as dis-ease. And so we have to really understand that, like as stewards of resources that rightfully belong to our communities and to our young people, to really shift that, we have to actually make sure we're in proximity to young people and what they're sharing. And so I want to share some truths of our young people. I wanted to see if I could have a few of our young folks on the call today, but they actually are in school. So I'm going to read some quotes, and these are pre-COVID quotes, truths of our youth. Realizing institutions don't work for you, but against you is the first step to healing your community. Let me say that again. Realizing institutions don't work for you, but against you is the first step to healing your community. And this second quote I'm going to read. Healing looks like education. If people understood their privilege and how their actions can deeply affect someone, I think that it would help a lot of people struggling with these issues. So 2 summary quotes, so many conversations from young people asking and calling on us to acknowledge the dehumanization of the systems responsible for them. That acknowledging it, and we've heard it over and over again. If we don't name it, we can't address it, we can't reconcile it, we can't repair it. And what we also know is that, you know, in the nonprofit industrial complex, people and our systems and our funders and our researchers, they don't want to know how we are, they want to know what we're going to do. And so what I want to offer in this space for those of us who are working in organizations is that I know that we have to do the busy work of logic models, of funding reports, of metrics that have no meaning for us, of metrics grounded in white supremacy. Like, how can we continue to sort of be successful in systems that honestly don't give a shit about us? And they won't give a shit about us. We have to do it for ourselves. And young people keep telling us over and over, and I'm sorry I'm cussing. I'm really actually trying not to, but this is just how I roll sometimes. And so we have actually created what we call a theory of liberation, because it is not enough to have a theory of change. Change still implies we're okay with the normalcy of white supremacy and anti-Blackness. And so we call on every organization, every system to create a theory of liberation. And what that means for us is that systems are transformed, and that might mean they have to actually be demolished. That includes our education system, our health systems, that there's no policy, investment, or practice about Black young folks, about brown young folks, or minoritized young folks without them at the center, but also that we don't make them overly responsible for what needs to happen. We also clearly, one of our key sort of domains, our measures of success is, do young people feel loved? And so we ask that directly. Do you feel that RISE loves you? Do you feel that RISE staff love each other? Do you feel like this is a space where you can think about love and explore it? And so we, again, call on our systems, our funding partners, our research partners, our advocacy policy partners to center love. So everything you do has to be actually grounded in that. And, you know, the resilience tropes, please, 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 let's stop trying to increase our resilience. Resilience, actually, no one gets to actually tell Black and brown kids that we have resilience. That's for us to decide and own for ourselves. Our existence is resilience enough. What we need is for white folks to increase their resilience to the systems that protect them. That's what we need you to do. We need you to get a thick skin. We need you to figure out how to sort of be in the discomfort, which is just not even a fraction of what the discomfort that our kids are in every day, and that so many of our families are in every day. And, you know, we need you to sort of also like let go of these ideas, these measures of readiness to learn, readiness to work, right? Why do Black and brown kids have to be ready to work? Why can't we actually let children be children? The adultification of Black and brown and poor kids is incessant. We get asked over and over, well, are you teaching them skills so they'll know how to work? Are you asking that to kids in resource neighborhoods? No. And what I keep hearing is this sort of, in this post-COVID, are we reopening schools, this learning loss? Like, are we gonna have learning loss? And I really hope that we lose the conditioning of supremacy we've learned in schools. I really hope that we lose that. So please let there be learning loss if it's about actually unlearning supremacy, if it's about unlearning the internalized conditioning that so many of us, including myself, have had, growing up and being educated in a system that actually, again, does not care about us. And what I want to say is that it's very hard to have to say that, you know, education and health systems are just as dehumanizing as policing systems and law enforcement systems. I want to make that clear, that it might look kinder, maybe the cuts come in a little softer, but it's a million cuts, right? And so I also want to say, as someone who works in Black and brown communities with Black and brown young people, as someone who is not Black, who is not Latinx, that for those of us who are not Black, for those of us who are white, we have so much work to do to relinquish the sort of incessantness and the anti-Blackness we hold and embolden. We have to do that too. White folks have to do that. White folks have to think about, this is your legacy. The dehumanization of our systems is your legacy. It's not ours. So you have to do that work. But for those of us who are also in this work, folks of color, non-Black folks of color, we actually have to really look at how we also cradle whiteness and white supremacy, and how we, that sort of also plays out in the ways we allow and enable anti-Blackness and allow our success in these systems to be based on that. So I could go on. I was told I have 2 minutes. I think the 2 minutes are up. Happy to share more. But please, 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 theories of liberation. Sick of theories of change. No to normalcy. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those comments, and really being quite provocative, I think, and important for us. And you can tell by the comments that your reflections are really resonating and motivating for everyone that's on this call. So, you know, building as we move into, and just let me remind everyone, if there are questions or comments, please post them in the chat, and we will definitely reserve some time to come back for your comments and questions. So, you know, we've talked a little bit about the environment in which this work occurs, the environment and the historical from Dr. Rousseau perspective on how did we get here. And Paul, I really appreciate your call to action that we need to move on this, and we need to challenge those and accept the racism that's embedded within our systems. So Angelica, as you think about the work that CDF is doing, how does this inform your policy and your advocacy work so that we are bringing these issues to the forefront, you know, at the national level, at the state level, and really driving policy change as well? So let me invite Angelica to bring her comments to this conversation.
Can you see and hear me? Yes, great.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you, Dr. Rousseau and Kanwarpal. I'm also shaking, and I'm going to contribute from the perspective of a policy advocate. I'm so lucky to be at the Children's Defense Fund and work to align theory and practice and really ground our advocacy in the lived experiences of young people, of parents and families. I'm going to focus today on social emotional support at school because Dr. Rousseau talked about Maslow's hierarchy, Kanwarpal talked about trauma and liberation. And we too believe, as so many have said this morning, that humanizing and healing environment is a condition for learning. At the Children's Defense Fund, we often look at the needs of students with disabilities, Black students, English learners, students in the foster care and juvenile justice systems, and other low-income students. And they've, you know, often been overlooked by our system, as so many have said already. The other sort of, when we look at the intersection of health and education, is really looking at trauma and trauma in schools and the way that schools traumatize students, often putting us into survival mode. And in schools, often the way that that looks is really having an impact on the brain and putting the brain into either a learning state or a survival state. And when we're in learning state, you know, we're in a calm and curious place. We're open to making mistakes because we know we're not going to get super penalized. But for those of us who've been penalized over and over, sometimes when we don't even make mistakes, we can often be in this survival mode. And it's more difficult to learn in survival mode because we're more anxious, more fearful, understandably, and also uncomfortable with learning new information and ambiguity. So it's so important that schools are ready to teach all students how to manage stress so that we can stay in that learning state. And in order to do that, students have to feel safe. They have to feel seen. They have to feel supported by adults. So it's very important that as we think about what our schools need, that they have that social emotional support, especially to address trauma. So when I think about before COVID, you know, California has had often very high student to support staff ratios. You know, counselors, nurses, school psychologists we're at the bottom or near bottom for student access to healthcare and mental health at school. When we look at what students are saying about feeling connected to school, pre-pandemic, one survey showed that about 74% of fifth graders expressed a sense of school connectedness. And then that drops in high school to 57%. And when we look at disaggregated data, that's 51% for Black students and English learners, 54% for Latinx students, and 45% for LGBTQIA plus students. Again, students are often traumatized at school, and especially our high need students of color. One example to look at are suspensions. The ultimate rejection that you can receive as a student, because you're literally ejected from your community. Sure, we've seen suspensions decline in the last several years, and yet disparities remain. Black students are 3.5 times more likely to be suspended than white students, Native students about 3 times. And then when we look at students with disabilities, they're 2 times more likely than the state average, and foster youth are 5 times more likely than the state average. Again, we have to name the problem if we're going to fix it, as Reverend Barber reminded us. Some of the schools with the highest suspension rates are actually alternative schools, as students have already been pushed out of because of suspensions. And so we're suspending them there as well. These are often schools run by the county offices of education, and they're serving our incarcerated students. So during COVID, I'm sure you all have seen a lot in the news, just the trauma that many of us have experienced during this last year. And not surprisingly, social emotional support has been less accessible to students as they're facing stress. Sometimes this stress is possible grief, economic instability, or struggling with missing friends. It's not abnormal. You would expect us all to feel stress during these unprecedented times. That's a normal behavior. The schools weren't able to meet the moment and address that. A lot of parents talked about how screen time was still excessive in school, and that workload did not decline during the pandemic. Students responded by expressing that they felt more isolated, more anxious, depressed, even suicidal ideation. One poll last fall found that about 70% of teenagers said they were struggling with their mental health. Student isolation was also has been uniquely intense also at schools within the carceral settings, where students have had to be quarantined sometimes. For a long time, their learning was limited to packets. And then when they finally got on virtual instruction, their faces had to be blurred due to security concerns. It's not humanizing. Okay, so now as we go into, a new normal, right? What are some solutions after COVID? I read somewhere, we need to emotionally regulate before we can educate. We really have to give students space to catch up with their friends, with their teachers, with their school staff. We have to meet the moment and provide schools with more social emotional support to all students, and then additional support to those who have really experienced more trauma. This strategy of social emotional support must be primary, on par with instructional. And yes, I'll say it also has to supersede instructional as we recover, as students are recovering. California has to invest. It's going to take maybe a few $1 billion to foster a social emotional safety net. That means hiring thousands of academic and social emotional counselors, nurses, psychologists, social workers. We have to really look at beyond local control of funding of schools, which is sort of the way schools are run. There should be a minimum level of resources at every school, which includes this social safety net, but also smaller class size, robust extracurricular activities, transformative justice. And we also need to stop traumatizing our students, provide anti-racist and anti-bias training, remove police and probation from schools, invest in culturally relevant curriculum. We have to foster the pipelines to hire teachers and staff of color from the local community, transform the ways that we serve students in the foster and juvenile justice systems. And we have to see parents as partners in this work. I'm going to end by just saying that I really want to advise my fellow advocates and researchers and others out there to counter the prevailing deficit-based narrative that students have to quickly recover and catch up from learning loss. Just like Kanwarpal said, this deficit frame has always been harmful. Like Dr. Rousseau said, the best thing that we could do for our students right now is recognize their strengths. They are surviving a global pandemic and so much more. Students must first humanize and heal, and we have to invest in social emotional support. Thank you.
Thank you. These have been incredible comments, really, and resonating strongly as I look at the comments in the chat. I think all of your comments have really resonated with the attendees and the participants in this discussion. So again, if there are any questions, please post them and we will bring them forward. I had one question that I just wanted to start the conversation with is, we absolutely, as we've heard, need to transform fundamentally our education system. Is a place that you have all commented on, in which some of these practices are really hurting, not helping our children of color in particular. What are some of your ideas around transforming our education and health systems over the next 3 to 5 years? And are there any spots that give you hope? Strategies, ideas that you would lift up that give you hope as we emerge from this post-pandemic environment? So I'm happy to start with any of you who has some comments on that question. Dr. Rousseau, would you start us off, perhaps?
You're on mute, Dr.
Maybe on
Rousseau.
mute. Let's hold on.
Here we
Thank
go.
you.
But I think there are some models that reflect thinking, not programs, models in mind. And this panel is exactly moving in that direction. Schools for a long time have said, give us your children, we'll train them, we'll send them back home. We've excluded the parents, we've demeaned the parents, and we have demeaned the culture and language that children bring with them. When we talk about community schools, we're saying we are absolutely trying to reverse that. We're trying to say that we know the school is only one entity in that community. And it's Bronfenbrenner teaches, it's the extent to which we work together that we will create the conditions, as Angelica said, for children to learn. So it's inside the school and outside the school. And community schools, I believe, reposition schools in communities as members of the community. Like John Dewey said in 1907, it's the place where voices are heard, parents can have their desire, and that we hire people who intentionally make these connections among us, because all of you here are doing good work, but often it is so isolated, it's in silos. So we've got to build partnerships around the child.
Thank you so much. And that thinking, Kanwarpal, I invite you to comment. I think that thinking is really embedded in the work that RISE has done.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really is about, it's not about a program or a toolkit or about a service delivery. It is really about a fundamental shift in our being, in our relationship, and that whatever we do, wherever we are, our work is to center relationships, to build loving relationships, to build loving community, to build loving power. And so what that looks like for a young person who comes into the media arts studio, what that looks like for a young person who comes in to get tutoring, young person who comes in to see a therapist, a young person who's been shot and is getting stabilization supports. For us as a system, everyone is a healer. And that is for us, we are healers. We are there to be in relationship. And then we're also there to provide support structures in the ways that work for young people. I think that piece around the co-regulation is so critical. And I also want to offer, it's about, I don't want to co-regulate if I'm trying to mitigate and reduce young people expressing how they feel. We often also use co-regulation as a way to not have young people actually share and express what's going on for them. So I would also offer that regulation is about full expression for them that is safe, no matter what they say, no matter how they show up, that they are safe to express themselves, because we know when we can do that, then it can lead to that attunement, that relationship, and then sort of what the work is, sort of the competency work. But if we don't do that, the other thing I'll say is we have to do it with each other. Young people tell us over and over again, we see adults, our families are stressed out. We need spaces for our families to be able to co-regulate and express and share. There's so much shame and isolation that again goes back to our fortitude and our resistance and our resilience, but that will never get recognized by the systems. It is still that deficit, and we're always a problem. So relationship, that's, you know, the outcomes, that's the logic model, that's everything. And again, relationships that are righteous, right? So it is also about making sure that they're grounded in relationships for liberation, for all our liberation.
Thank you, Kanwarpal. I also want to add on to say that an exciting effort that my colleague Janice and others at the United Ways are working on is a way to make it easier for schools to have more access to school-based mental health, especially. And this fits right into, I think, also the framework for community schools. It's the Healthy Start Bill, AB 1117, which would essentially create a grants program so that schools could partner with trusted community leaders to coordinate healthcare, social services, trauma-informed mental health and behavioral health services for students and families. It's also focused on communities that have been most hard hit by COVID-19. So again, it just helps to break down those silos so that we can co-locate practice and healing.
And, you know, in our work at First 5 LA, we see such silos, not just between the education system and community systems, but also between the healthcare system and community-based services. And, you know, as we all, even thinking about from the healthcare perspective, so much of health occurs outside of the healthcare system, those social determinants of health. And I think changing the mindset, as all of you have spoken to some degree, to demonstrate that by the healthcare system partnering with community organizations, they're going to improve their outcomes. That this very siloed thinking, which is so pervasive, really hinders families and the outcomes for children. I know I think we have about 3 minutes if I'm watching my clock, and I know we're anxious to hear from Dr. Tony Thurmond. Very quickly, I'll do a quick rapid fire. If there is one takeaway that each of you would want the audience to take from today in maybe, you know, a minute or less, is there one takeaway that you would want to make sure that all of our attendees take with them as they move from this conference today? Dr. Rousseau, one thought or one takeaway?
To value the assets that children bring from their families and communities, and that they are worthy assets to build learning on, and to honor their humanity in schools.
Thank you. Love that comment. Thank you, Dr. Rousseau.
Yeah, I would say this is about how are we going to be, not what are we going to do.
Yes.
I feel like I'm going to repeat what others have already said. Reverend Barber reminded us to ask children how they're doing. I'm going to add to that, ask the parents too. Thank you, Kanwarpal, for bringing the voice of children into this, children and youth, into this space. And just take care of yourselves because it's a long fight.
Yes, I agree. And you know, as we do work in trauma-informed care, and as we learn more about this space, we applaud the work of our Surgeon General, Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, who's really given visibility to the connection between experience of trauma and educational outcomes and experience of trauma and health outcomes, and really applaud her work. I think, you know, we have to start with the question that is not, you know, what's wrong with you, but what happened to you and how can we embrace children? And I fully, I just want to thank you all. This has been an incredible panel. I'm humbled by the wisdom that you've all brought to it. And I will close there as we move on to our next session. Thank you all.
Can I just add one more thing? I wanted to say, if it's not racially just, it cannot be trauma informed. And healing centered is not just asking about what happened, It is about acknowledging, we know what's happened. I mean, we've heard this over and over. We know what's happened. So how can we show up righteously and with unconditional, righteous, industrious love? Thank you.
Thank you again to all the panelists.
Thank you.
And thank you to all of our speakers for grounding us and taking us to the root. As Dr. Love said, I am pleased to introduce us to our second keynote speaker, Tony Thurmond, who is our California State Superintendent of Public Instruction. I know we have just a few minutes with you, and so I would like to spend that time. We're just posing a couple of questions of you. Again, thank you for joining us today. So I'd like to ask you questions focused around transformation. And I know you have a very difficult job, given that you do oversee the largest school system in our nation. So let me just go there. What are the most important changes that the California Department of Education can make at this time to uproot racism from schools and uphold and nurture the minds and lives of Black children and youth at school, Superintendent Thurmond?
No, thank you for the question. Thank you all for allowing us to be on. I have to tell you, I missed the days when we were running Freedom School programs in Alameda County, where I had great pleasure to work. And I imagine that those might be going on by Zoom, but there's nothing like Harambe. And I look forward to the days when we can bring that kind of culturally rich, literacy-based intervention to our students. And I think it's a perfect example of the ways that what we do in education has to change. The pandemic has put an even bigger spotlight on learning gaps that we were trying to close, the opportunity gap that we know impacts our African-American, our Latino, our low-income students, where their experiences are different than their more affluent and white peers. And it has just put a spotlight on that. And we've seen it further exacerbated by the pandemic, from anything you can think of, from students who need it the most without computers and access to the internet. And I mean, if we're in distance learning, how are students supposed to learn without the most basic tools? And so what it has meant for me at the Department of Education has establishing a task force to close the digital divide, and that we need to do that in our lifetime so that students have access to computers and high-speed internet. We've got a innovation challenge that we're now running. We're prepared to provide $1 million prize to someone who comes up with a solution to push us to the next level in terms of closing the broadband gap that anyone can participate in. We think that this is also forcing us to have a real conversation that many have been having about finding different ways to measure learning that don't just involve high stakes testing. Quite frankly, I feel like the high stakes testing scenario was failing kids of color to begin with. We think that this means that we have to have real conversations about addressing racism and bias in our schools. And people are so afraid to even have the conversation. And so we've been reaching out to school districts to say, let us give you some resources to address implicit bias training. We've done that through some great partnerships with some fabulous equity groups. We've also done that through professional development in a series that we call Education to End Hate, that allows us to deal directly with racism in our schools, with Islamophobia in our schools, with bullying against Asian American students or LGBTQ+ students, dealing with anti-Semitism and hate, and providing training directly to educators. We're starting the conversation. Obviously, we're happy to work with partners like the Children's Defense Fund and my good friend, Kanwarpal, who was really speaking truth in that last panel. We're happy to work with RISE and other places to make sure that we address these issues in our schools, especially with the disproportionality that African-American students experience around suspensions and other things. We're really putting a spotlight on these things and providing some resources to make some changes in the experience of our students of color.
Thank you for that, Superintendent Thurmond. Speaking of resources, we have the facts tell us that prior to the pandemic, many students, but especially students with disabilities, foster youth, just as involved students, and homeless students were being underserved in school settings, and that they needed more supports. how do you envision the return to school changing or improving education programming for these high need student groups?
Given the exacerbation of the challenges that these same groups of students have faced, I think we're going to have to provide social emotional supports. I know that you all were talking about that and how to address trauma. I'm sponsoring legislation that would get more dollars to our schools to have more counselors. We held a conversation this last year where we said our schools don't need police officers being the disciplinarians of student behavior. We need more counselors. My office right now is continuing to provide more dollars for restorative justice programs. We've already allocated $90 million in the last few years under AB 1014, which takes money from the criminal justice system and puts it into preventative programs for schools. We've got another allocation that we're putting out right now that districts can apply for. More community schools money. We think that we think that in short order, as schools start to reopen, we're going to need to provide more supports for students around counseling, small group work, working through after-school programs, enrichment programs in the summer, and providing more supports to teachers, professional development, and a lot of tutoring. And of course, teachers and educators will have to help assess where students enter so that we can identify what are the kinds of additional supports that our students will need. The state just passed a major package that was of a bill that was signed today that will provide $4.5 billion more in resources to school districts to do what we call accelerated learning, to really support more tutoring, more coaching, professional development, working on summer programs. And I believe that these are many of the things that we're going to have to do to support those students whose needs have been exacerbated during the pandemic.
That's great news. Again, that additional resources are coming down to our districts and our schools. Given that, what does effective state monitoring of counties and districts look like in this era of local control? Again, and as these new dollars or additional dollars flow.
I think we have to really have a real reconciliation about the poor data systems that we have in this state. It makes no sense, given the technological sort of advance that we have in California, that we have data systems that literally cannot keep up with when a family moves from one district to the next. And so our ability to track families that need support and their attendance has been impacted. We have no way to really know. We have no way to know during the pandemic, who has checked into school and who hasn't, not in real time. And given where things are, we can't afford to just wait until the end of the school year to know who's struggling and who hasn't checked in. And so there's an effort right now to build a brand new data system. And they're calling it the cradle to career longitudinal data system. We've got to do a refresh on the data system that our school districts use to report on student performance across multiple measures. It needs an incredible refresh. It's been difficult for us to even know which schools were open for in-person or remote instruction because we have no real system for collecting data in real time. We're literally out there, my team is literally out there on the phone calling people saying, what's your situation? And then we're uploading it into a database. This is California. We have to do better. And if you can imagine, if we have those kind of systems that are that outdated, imagine what it really means when we say we want to know what your data looks like for suspension rates for African Americans or for preschool students of color who are being expelled and suspended. What do you do to get expelled or suspended in preschool? There's a bill right now, by the way, that would preclude that would forbid that. And we've got to really change our practices. Data is a tool and it should never be used to punish our families and our schools. There's a lot of work that we have to do, but we're committed to continuing to do that work.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Superintendent Thurmond. We are here for that. We know the challenges are grand, but we know that our communities, those most impacted, have solutions. And so we look forward to working with you and your team and our partners in making sure that our children have the resources that they need. Again, thank you for being with us today. I know we are out of time and we need to transition over to our next plenary.
Thank you. You take care and be well.
Thank you so much. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Dominique Nong.
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today and for joining what someone has called a teach-in. We're now here moving for our final panel titled Transformative Justice, Dismantling Destructive Models of Economic Stability and Public Safety. We've been fortunate enough to assemble a powerful group of visionary thought leaders and fierce advocates who are here to deepen our understanding of our destructive juvenile justice and public benefit systems, and then guide us to reimagine, to envision a more just and equitable society, to transform the way so many of our previous guests have urged us to do. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to let you know that we have reserved some time for audience questions at the end. So if you'd like to submit a question, please use the Q&A function in Zoom. And now on to our guests. First is Alfredo Gama, president of the Central Alameda Neighborhood Council, former Ella Baker trainer, and servant leader intern in the CDF Freedom Schools program. Next, we have Kimmy Maniquis, executive director of SIPA, Search to Involve Filipino Americans, and former executive director of the California Conference for Equality and Justice and Pure Health Exchange LA. Also joining us today is Professor Jyoti Nanda, associate professor of law at Golden Gate University, whose research focuses on the intersection of gender, race, disability, education, and juvenile justice. And to round our powerhouse panel today, we have Ronaldo Rani Villeda, advocate and community organizer at the Anti-Recidivism Coalition, executive director of Hoops for Justice, and co-founder of Underground Grit in Orange County, California. And so Professor Nanda, I'd like to turn to you first. This past year, the COVID pandemic and the high-profile murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor laid bare the unconscionable inequities related to poverty, health, and the juvenile and adult correction systems. Could you take some time to provide some historical context that has often been missing from many of our conversations, context that is critical to helping us understand the problem and then forging some solutions?
Absolutely, it would be my honor to do so. Thank you to all of my panelists, my fellow panelists. I'm honored to be on this panel with you, to Shimica Gaskins for inviting me, and to Dominique Nong for the invitation to be here today. My 5 minutes with you will attempt to set the groundwork for our hour together, but I thought before we start, I would like to start with a quote from Arundhati Roy, who's an Indian author and activist, given that we're living in a pandemic. She says, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks, and our dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us, or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. I'm going to talk to you today about our juvenile justice or juvenile criminal justice system in a few minutes and give you a little bit of a history to provide context. As many of you know, tonight, more than 48,000 youth in this nation will sleep somewhere other than their homes as a result of a juvenile justice or criminal justice involvement. Most of these youth are held in restrictive correctional style facilities, and thousands are held without even having a trial. For Black youth, the chance is more than 5 times that of white youth that they're inside a facility. For Latino youth, the chance of this occurring is more than double of white youth. And U.S. Department of Justice data reveals such glaring disproportionality is reflected in nearly every state in our country. Youth of color, as many of you know, are also arrested, charged, and incarcerated more than white youth for similar conduct, and are disproportionately represented at every decision-making point in the juvenile criminal justice system. Studies even show that this advantage increases as they move deeper through the system. Moreover, and perhaps more importantly, youth of color are incarcerated at rates that cannot be explained by crime alone. And even though the numbers have been dropping, and I'll talk about that as we move further through our conversation, the numbers of youth that have dropped about 60% in the last 20 years or so. I know for many of us that are here today and probably listening today, and I know Children's Defense Fund, that until there are no youth that are incarcerated, the work continues. So how did we get here? The juvenile justice history is long, and I'm not a historian. I'm a criminal law professor, juvenile justice advocate. So what I'm giving you today is a quick snapshot in a few minutes. that will provide some context. We know from the earliest days of our nation, segregationist policies dictated the detention of youth of color and poor youth, and that would be different than that of white youth. In the early 18th and 19th centuries, courts punished and confined youth in jails and penitentiaries. Many youth were confined for non-criminal behavior simply because there were no other options. And at the same time, American cities were confronting high rates of poverty and neglect that was putting pressure on city leaders to fashion a solution to this emerging social issue, or what I would say is an injustice. In response, penal reformers Thomas Eddy and John Griscombe organized the Society for the Prevention of Pauperism to oppose housing youth in adult jails and prisons. Their work led to the New York House of Refuge in 1825, which was the first institution designed to house poor, destitute, and vagrant youth who were deemed by authorities to be on the path towards delinquency. The New York House of Refuge became the first movement in what was later called the juvenile justice system, or what now some of us call the juvenile criminal system, in a nod to removing justice from the title. Within 3 years of its opening, similar institutes were opened up in Boston and Philly, and by the 1840s, approximately 25 more facilities were throughout the country. Just to give you a picture of what these look like, House of Refuges were large fortress-like congregate-style institutions that were located in urban areas for youth designated as abandoned, delinquent, or incorrigible. The average number of youth in a house of refuge was 200, but some, like in New York, were about 1,000, 1,200 or so. What we also know, thanks to the brilliance of Dr. Bell at the Haywood Burns Institute, is that when the House of Refuge was established, it had a colored section. This was in 1834, where Black children were excluded from rehabilitation services because it was rationalized as a waste of resources and a debasement for white as young people. In Pennsylvania and Mississippi, the prevailing statement was that, quote, white taxpayers refused to waste money on the needs of incorrigible young Blacks. And this differential treatment continued. Through the 1800s, the exclusion of Black youth from white juvenile facilities often resulted in their placement of prisons. In 1850, approximately 50% of youth in Rhode Island were Black, 60% in Maryland were Black, and all youth in DC were Black, despite the region's large white populations. Again, to speed up the history, because I could be here all day, you never give a professor a mic, the overrepresentation of youth of color in the penal system also served as convenient for labor needs in the post-Civil War South. A significant reason for the opening of the Baltimore House of Reformation for Black children in Maryland was the need for agricultural labor through the states, as well as the great want of competent use of servants. The judicial system was, and we should make no mistake about it, retooled to provide cheap forced labor to mines, farms, timber camps, and alike. In the decades that followed, as our country emerged as an industrial power and growth, we also saw an increase in police force, and police themselves began referring youth to the juvenile justice system. In 1940, the LAPD was arresting, no surprise, youth of color disproportionately. Latinos in 1940 constituted 30% of all boys arrested by the LAPD when they were only 8% of the population. Blacks were 12% of arrests compared to only 4% of the population. And I know that my esteemed panelists that are going to come after me are going to bring you up to speed, but one statistic that I'm going to leave you with here was the impact that this had, particularly in California, on monolingual youth. In the 1940s, monolingual youth serving time in the California State Reform School in Whittier were given a battery of tests in English. Based on the results, school officials labeled more than 60% of Latino youth as feeble-minded or unable to develop beyond the intellectual level of a 12-year-old. And because I write a lot in disability and care deeply about ableism, I'm going to leave you here knowing that today we have 40 to 80% of our youth in the halls are dealing with one or more unaddressed disability. And I put that in quotes so that we can have a more complicated conversation. So just to be clear, the system in many ways was designed to do exactly what it was designed to do.
Thank you, Professor Nanda, for rooting us in our history and for really exposing the anti-Black roots that Dr. Love and others urged us to focus on. I know for me, it is always hurts my heart and it's troubling to hear it, but I know that it's important. We have to name what's going on now, and we have to name what has been going on in our past. And so moving forward to what's going on now, I'd like to turn to you first, Kimmy, and then Rana and Alfredo, and really ask you to share where that history that Professor Nanda gave us has led us today. What are youth and families experiencing right now? Kimmy?
Great. Thank you, Dominique. Thank you, Professor Nanda, also for providing that context. It is an honor to be here to have this discussion with you all. I can share from the Asian American Pacific Islander perspective some of what we're seeing. And I also look forward to hearing what Alfredo and Ronnie are going to share, especially with regard to the juvenile criminal justice systems. So Asian Americans are the fastest growing racial group and at the same time experiencing the fastest growing poverty rates in the country. This is especially the case for Southeast Asians, which include Hmong, Cambodian, and Laotians, as well as for Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. AAPIs are also still contending with the impacts of mass incarceration and how it feeds the pipeline of deportation. In the 90s, when we saw incarceration rates skyrocketing, AAPI incarceration grew by 250%, and arrests of AAPI youth during a 20-year period during that time grew by 726%, with some of the most impacted being Samoan, Cambodian, and other Southeast Asian youth. Deportation of people with old criminal records is an increasing concern and area of advocacy. Since the 90s, there have been an estimated 15,000 deportation orders for AAPI people, most of whom came here as refugees to seek safety, only to experience additional trauma at the hands of systems here. So what does this mean for the community? There's so much more to talk about beyond this 2 minutes that we have, but we do know that Asian American, Pacific Islander, Native Hawaiian families and young people continue to be entangled in the systems that we're discussing today, the public benefit system, the criminal justice system, child welfare and immigration. And this also challenges the notion that connected to the model minority myth of Asian exceptionalism, which neglects to recognize all of these issues that AAPI folks are struggling with. It also demonstrates that this is not a monolithic group. The experiences of ethnic groups within this umbrella category have a wide variation of experience, history, identity, and interaction with the systems here in the US. And because we see families struggling, especially and becoming especially more vulnerable during times like these where there are increasing economic challenges and violence against elders, there is this increased need for data, especially disaggregated data, so that we can fully understand the full picture of how certain groups are disproportionately impacted and how they might tie to similar trends that we're seeing with Black and Latinx communities.
Thank you, Kimmy, for providing that often overlooked perspective and really for highlighting that the impact of anti-Black narratives really affect and harm all of our communities of color. Ronnie, I'd like to turn to you now and wondering if you could shed some light on what our juvenile justice system, or rather juvenile injustice system, looks like today.
Of course. Thank you, Dominique. Hello to all my panelists. Hello to everybody in the Zoom world. Can't believe it's been a year since this has started. But yeah, I mean, my first encounter with law enforcement was at the age of 7 when I was walking home from school. And, you know, gang unit pulled me over. They jumped out of the car. They knew that my brother and my cousins were affiliated with the local gang. So they just assumed that I also was a gang member at 7 years old. And, you know, they jumped out. They're like, what's up? Where you from? What do they call you? Where are the drugs? You know, they proceed to, you know, pat me down, search my backpack. They didn't find anything, obviously. And then they just went on their way. But like fast forwarding a decade, 10 years later, I'm 17 and I officially entered the system. First time I was ever arrested, and I'm facing life in prison. And I didn't know like what was going on. This was the first time I had ever been in a situation like that. And I was being called a cold and calculated monster. And I can just, that was the first time I ever encountered the stigma that youth, but especially youth who commit violent crimes, are not worthy, that I wasn't worthy. And staff made it plain and clear. We're not going to waste our time and resources on you because you're headed to prison. Like, you're going to be washed up. Like, you're nobody. And, it was like a shock, culture shock for me, but also it was something that, it made me realize that, the stigmas for people who commit crimes and like what we do with them and how we provide resources to them, like there was nothing there. It was fundamentally flawed. And basically the message was, we're gonna throw you away. Like, you're disposable. And just like tying it back to like the increased police presence in communities of color, leading to a higher likelihood that youth are going to be incarcerated or come in contact with the system. And then like once they're in the system, right? Like once they're entrapped, it's nearly impossible to get out. And it's just like, there's this cycle, this constant perpetuation of trauma, but there's also this cycle of just like punishment over healing, retribution over love, right? Like, it just, it really amazes me, right? Just thinking about it, talking about it to you guys. But then it's just like, to a further extent, you have youth who are on probation, who might be battling, drug addiction, who have traumatic experiences that they haven't dealt with properly. They don't know how to cope with their emotions. They don't know how to articulate their emotions, sorry. And all they have is a probation officer, right? And it's hard to be vulnerable. It's hard to really ask for help, because at the same instance, you asking for help can be an admission of guilt that only further sucks you into the system. And, it's examples like that just show how broken and just the desperate need to recreate the system.
Ronnie, thank you so much, and for allowing yourself to be vulnerable and share that story, going all the way back to you being 7 years old. Thank you for your vulnerability and your courage. Alfredo, I'm going to turn to you now to have you tell us even more about what's important for us to know about what's going on today.
I think we have a few minutes. So this is a story of Audrey Hendricks by Cynthia Livingston, illustrated by Vanessa Brantley. It's a story part of our CDF curriculum, one of my favorite years. And it's about children who are looking for adults to support them. No one did, so they took it upon themselves. And you all know what happened. In Audrey Hendricks' spirit, I want to first thank you for your time, your spirit, and your commitment to children in your homes, your communities, and all over California in particular. Our children's health, emotional, and spiritual well-being and safety is of utmost urgency. Last summer of civil uprising and health pandemic, the youth and elders in the neighborhood came together to execute the most comprehensive federal, state, and local COVID-19 plan to feed, read, and care for our children. We pulled together when parents were out laboring for your essential services and businesses to sustain what was left of this fragile Los Angeles economy. The CDF shelter-in-place freedom school was a success and a light beam of hope, despite its many obstacles and challenges. This past summer, the children of the Pueblos they were a light amidst darkness and civil uprising. They were resilient when adults who were supposed to protect them failed. This light gave us strength and energy. After an armed officer of the LAPD Community Safety Partnership walked into the space and noticed this very same book and used it to draw extreme police and city official surveillance and harassment. It escalated to the eventual violent closure of the shelter in place for our children. After weeks of shelter in place, children were left outside, lined up to eat breakfast. One day they woke up to missing laptops, food, and even a microwave. They said it was for LAPD exclusive programs. The officers withdrew all essential center equipment because we were not actively, officially collaborating and complying with their abuse and PR campaigns by city officials. This virus is an additional pandemic on top of poverty, learning gap, technological divide, houselessness, racism, and state violence. Hurt and trauma that murder the children in our community. While the mayor of Los Angeles was announcing his model of policing through his community safety partnership, children were left outside. They were confronting the reality, the real reality of lack of services and disrespect on behalf of his top appointed officials, his own LAPD CSP program and the housing authority officials. This policy we're talking about is born out of attitudes, behaviors, history we talked about. The mayor ignored questions about services for children of essential poor workers. I asked him that question to his face through Zoom. And he deviated from the question and said, oh, other nature parks are open, go to them. An hour away in the middle of a pandemic. But since then, he poured $8 million more in increased LAPD Community Safety Partnership Officer programs. Islands that pushes our children to visit their childhood experiences, to wash windows, labor for predatory businesses, and participate in non-private services. And I love Reverend Barber because he's talking about those $200 banquets. The exploitation and abuse of children must come to a halt. Richard Risher from the Nickerson Gardens housing projects was gunned down at 18 years old when he was shot in the back after officers fired 64 shots. Daniel Perez, right here, 16, down the street, was walking down Ascot Elementary when LAPD shot him dead after an alleged mental health crisis. They ruled it suicide by cop. Jesse Romero in East LA was 14. Our kids' fathers and mothers are in shackles in prison for 8, 20, 30 years. Our children are hurting. We must halt the violence. Community safety is and will be community-led and accountable. We will continue to protect our children. African and Black children are Native children. Native Mexican and Central American and all communities will continue mutual aid and continue service to each other. We will continue to love and support one another. We have nothing to lose but our chains. That is the children of Central Alameda, that is their state. That is the light of young people in this sacred land. Thank you, Dr. Ms. Edelman, and just everyone who made this space possible.
Thank you, Alfredo. If we can just all take a moment to sit with that for a bit. We could take the time to send our energy and our love to Alfredo, to Ronnie, to all those children and families that he has spoken about and lifted up here today. We're a community, and we're all here to support one another. And we're all here because we firmly believe that we can achieve a more caring, a more healing, a more equitable society. And so the people here have expressed the pain, and but the strength that they've shown is how to move forward and what we do with that pain and what we do with our history. So I know it's hard right now, but if possible, I'd like you all to help us show the way forward, to help give us some of the solutions to these problems that have been entrenched for so long. And Professor Nanda, if I could start with you.
Well, I think what I would like to lift before we continue is a definition of anti-Black racism, because to me it speaks so squarely with what Alfredo and Rolando just so beautifully shared with us. So when we say anti-Black racism, it's more than just racism against Black people. That sort of oversimplifies and in some ways defangs it. It's a theoretical framework that illuminates society's inability to recognize our humanity, the disdain, disregard, and disgust for our existence. And these are the words of Kiana Mireya Ross on anti-Black racism. And I think I want to start there because what we heard in Alfredo's voice and Rolando's story so powerfully is the disdain that we seem to have for certain segments and members of our society. It's sort of a lack of humanity. If you're asking me, Dominique, to talk about how to look forward, I'm of two minds. Part of me, and I'm sure many of you feel this way, follows the book actually my students are currently reading by Nell Bernstein called Burning Down the House. She suggests that we have to completely do over the way we treat children in the criminal legal system. Completely do over. One would argue we have to abolish schools and completely start over, restructuring, so that all of our schools are modeled after the CDF's freedom schools. The other part of me thinks that we're here and now, and we have children that Alfredo mentioned, communities that are hurting right now, today, that are in pain. I mean, we have clients, many of us have clients that are inside the halls that we see, that we meet, that we need to address. And so what I tell my students is what I'm going to start with now, which is that we have to do both. We have to seek to dismantle the systems that got us here of oppression, but we also have to find ways to systemically work with the laws that exist to ensure that the majority of our young people are safe, free, and outside of the halls. So I think we need a two-prong approach. And all of us that are here listening today and here on the screen today and in this room today have a role. We all have a role in sort of our placement and what we need to do. But if our ultimate goal is to dismantle systems of oppression and lift the voices of everybody that exists, then we have to kind of think about what that role would look like. And so I don't know if you want me to speak more about the specific role I'm playing, or if you want us to talk about the roles that we play, or where's places in which we think all of us can work together. I leave that to you, but I think that that's really the way I like to frame the conversation around movement and change, because one without the other to me feels very dissatisfying.
Thank you, Jyoti. If you can maybe just highlight one really powerful project that I know you're working on so that people have a better sense of specifically what things people are doing now and how they can support, that'd be great.
Sure. So I'm working on a few projects, but I think the one Dominique is referring to is the one that I'm working about girls in incarceration, pregnant girls specifically that are incarcerated. We're starting with LA County. We're in partnership with Vera with our goal to end all incarceration of girls in 10 years. We started by working with ending the incarceration of pregnant girls in LA County for all of the obvious reasons. And when I say girls, I use the term, the cisgender term of girls, recognizing the limitation of that term, but that's the way they're identified within our halls. And that's the term that we're using to identify them for our purposes of advocacy. And our concern is the obvious one, that you can imagine the compounding vulnerabilities on girls that are inside the halls, and, and especially given their unborn child, and that by no public health standards, human rights standards, civil rights standards, should pregnant women be inside in an incarcerated facility, sort of writ large. I mean, there's no public health official or doctor that you could find that would tell you that that's proper for young people. So our current project, and this may be of interest to folks on the call, for advocates that are listening broadly, for elected officials, is that thankfully, after cooperation working for 2 years with the county, we were just granted an order by the juvenile court to have data released about the girls that have been inside the halls for the last 5 years. And I've been listening all morning about lack of information about our communities and how limited and how difficult it is to move forward when we don't have that information. So what we're looking to do now is open up those doors. They've allowed for us to get aggregate data of the girls that have been in the halls for 5 years. We're hoping that will also includes case file review of girls. And what we're hoping to glean is we're hoping to tell stories, much like Alfredo and Ronnie are doing here today, specific stories about who these children are, what their needs are, what their unmet needs are, how many gaps are in our system. I mean, and one thing that we've already figured out, and this will not be surprising to people here today, is that, most of this data does not exist in one place. That the systems that police our children look at one aspect of them at a time, when we all know that we look at the child as a whole, right? I mean, that's what CDF is modeled after, what Dr. Edelman founded this organization on, that we look at the whole child. There is nothing about the way our carceral facilities incarcerate young people today that looks at the whole child. There's nothing about it. And I wait for the day, I hope in my lifetime, I believe in my lifetime, the day will come when that happens. But that is ultimately our goal. And just to fast forward, our ultimate goal for this research is to help lift non-carceral placement options for girls that are currently in locked facilities. So our goal is to give options to the court to say, you want a non-carceral option for a girl where she can still be rehabilitated according to the mandate of juvenile justice. These are the options in their own community. These are the services that these girls need. This is what sort of we need to have, so that when our counterparts go into court and ask for these girls to be removed, are not told by the court that there are no safe options for these girls.
Thank you, Jyoti, for sharing that, and really for sharing your thoughts on the two-pronged approach, but also on the work you're doing now to really find alternatives to the system we have in place, and ones that really bring our young people back into their communities, which is where they find their strength. Ronnie, if I could turn to you, I know you've been intimately involved in really leading some transformative work here in LA County, which is a huge solution. And we're always looking, especially today, for ways to transform. So if you could take some time to talk about that.
Yes, of course. I think for me, my way, I guess my vision forward is, this process that I've been a part of, Youth Justice Work Group. I was very fortunate to be a part of it last year. It was about an 11-month process. The board kind of tasked us with this big responsibility to create a new department rooted in youth development that removes all youth from probation, and we put them in this new department, right? Really just focusing on it was obviously a broad work group, but leaving no stone unturned. And for me, the most important aspect of this whole process was the centering of youth voices, like myself and my peers within the Layup Coalition. Really being intentional about how we create spaces for youth to show up and share their experiences. A big one, today with Alfredo, speaking truth to power. But when sometimes when you speak about these experiences, the trauma that we carry and the pain, it's a lot of vulnerability, right? I was able to be a part of the Alternatives to Incarceration subcommittee, and just like the overarching themes of like Youth Justice Reimagined is the things that are lacking in the current system, love, compassion, humanity, treating kids like they deserve to be treated, right? Not treating them like less than. And that to me is very powerful, because that's foundational for the entire infrastructure of this new department. But like also just like Youth Justice Reimagined, what it's advocating for as well is, safe and secure healing centers within the community that are 24 hours a day, youth empowerment and support teams that we would call instead of calling the police to help mitigate situations within the community. Heavy emphasis on restorative and transformative justice practices. That to me is the most important part of the entire infrastructure for me. It should be at the forefront, right? It's showing people that this is the way that we can do things. This is how we, as a community, resolve these issues. Because, right now we have this like perception that law enforcement loves to use as a reason to incarcerate youth. Oh, well, public safety, we need to keep the community safe. And it's like really like taking public safety and just reimagining it to be, a community-led and inclusive space where just youth are able to be themselves, be vulnerable, but also like teaching them the importance of repairing harms and what that looks like. We don't have that in our communities. It's something that's not there, right? And it's like the credible messengers, people like myself, people who have experienced this in their lifetime, right? Working hands-on with youth, and that to me is I think it's the most important, but it's also what's going to make it work. And it's something that hasn't been done before. This is historical. We're the first county in the entire nation to do this. It's a $500 million budget that we're going to reallocate, and we're going to give it to our communities, right? To CBOs. We're going to make sure that this money is well spent and it's not all going to salaries and benefits, right? We want to be intentional and just really meaningful with what we do. But it's grounded in that, love, the compassion, and like these transformative justice practices to me, for myself personally, have just been so healing. And I can just see that in our communities, just really making a change and changing the stigma around like what it means to love yourself and care for yourself and take care of your mental health and your well-being.
Thank you, Ronnie, for all the work you do to advance that new vision in LA. Alfredo, if it's possible to turn back to you, and going off of what Ronnie had said about really efforts right now to invest, right? To invest back in our communities. I know you had highlighted when you were talking earlier about the money, one of the problems was the increased money, the 8 million, I believe you said, that were going to police programs. And so if you could share a little bit more now about what are the solutions, you'd highlighted the power of young people who had banded together. And wonder if you could share a little bit more about our way forward.
Yes. Again, thank you everyone for being here today. I think we all have that child spirit in us where we think going to the other universe is possible. That's how I feel sometimes when I work with these kids. And that spirit we must protect our children, our culture, and each other's mental and physical health through music, literature, and advocacy. We must include the knowledge of self, history, biology, environmental science, and other fields of research that will help us combat environmental violence. Now, I'm a policy debate nerd in high school. And back in high school, we used to debate these things like we knew what we were talking about, but now I know what I'm talking about. And I think this is possible because the California state budget is like almost 200 billion, plus all the taxes corporations don't pay. We need, and I always know we get 10% of what we always get. All this grant writing stuff, I learned the trick. You know, so we have to immediately, this is a whole plan text, we can do this. And we have mechanisms doing it right now in the city of Los Angeles. These kids literally went to prison. The things the kids were willing to do this summer, I was not willing to do. I was like, I'm gonna go to jail. I'm gonna go back to Mexico if they get me. These kids do not care. So this is in policy debate, we call this the plan text. We're going to immediately invest reparations. 100 billion in Black children from Watts, the Pueblos. And I'm saying this because I sat on a board where we oversaw $5 billion. Easy money. I saw how that money went in and out. Nickerson Gardens and every single housing projects and its surroundings and neighborhoods historically that have been looted, abused, and denied of services already paid in taxes. We pay taxes, labor, unpaid labor. Through the Central Alameda Neighborhood Council Public Fund. It is part of the city charter. The city lied to me and said that we couldn't get any funds to a public elected neighborhood council body, that our powers are only at advisory. Turns out I read a book. I read the city charter. And I read the power we have as people who were elected in the city of Los Angeles, whereby funds are transferred directly impacted communities, especially to the children all over California that represent Central Alameda. Organizations, educators, nonprofit, and all levels of government should listen to the directly impacted children of Central Alameda on March 20th. That is our next general board meeting. The neighborhood council meets once a month, the third Saturday at 11 a.m. Funds, and we have the funding for this. I'm telling you directly what we're getting this. Cannabis sales tax. You know how much weed they sell in my neighborhood? How much money gets out of my people getting high and nothing comes back? Nothing. Property tax, how much rent we pay? People are getting evicted out of their houses, paying rent for years. Nothing in return. Sales tax, HACLA. Have you all read their books? Reverend Barber was talking about the $200 banquets. Their banquets are $2,000. You know, I met Reverend Barber 6 years ago, and people say I'm crazy, but I was like, Reverend Barber told me. I stopped going to church because people stopped serving, and Jesus was all about service. Any restriction, because these lawyers and City Hall, general counsels love to make restrictions. They fought everything poor people wanted. Council said, oh, that's out of order. It's not within the subject. Any restriction will be just fiated through the powers of the City Hall or the mayor. The city council can do it. We have to advocate. We're all over Los Angeles. We're all over California. We will have a joint general board and education committee meeting to set policy and give direct actions you can take in civics. Culture, we have to be happy. Kids were so happy this summer. When they closed us down, instead of being sad, they were reading a book where it talked about reclaiming old spaces. And at that time, we were having all this information about Black spaces. And it turns out that in Bruce's Beach, the city council use their power to take away a Black space worth millions of dollars. And the kids got empowered, and we took them to read a chapter book, a college level book. Middle schoolers were reading. Where, Reverend Barber says we have to name them, but I'm not, right? Because these people have to vote for what we're proposing. But a lot of people don't feel like our kids can read that. So all these racist attitudes must be first eliminated from self. We must take a step back and breathe, get away and let it all out. If you want to, you can skip away. The kids taught me, because the kids, when you listen to them play, they teach you how to resolve conflicts without violence. We must skip away from divisive rhetoric and attention from defund the police narrative. No one wants to defund anyone. Have you seen these officers? They're tired. They're scared of me, and they're scared of you sometimes. And instead, we should focus on the children affected by trauma from all forms of city, business, and racist violence. It's not just police. I used to see, I'm not gonna name names, but someone said we should abolish schools. I agree. When they shut us down, it felt like we abolished schools and we were going to the beach to read in nature. And these kids were actually reading. That music in Altadena, oh my gosh, those kids will never forget that experience. That's culture. That's real learning. So we're not under-resourced. We're not underfunded. We're not divided. It's just been historical looting from people in the high levels of government, high levels of government, right? I remember one time I was in the farm, and when the elders speak, I listen. Miss Edelman was speaking. Miss Edelman was speaking. And Giovanni spoke. She said, "Young people, you have to start a revolution." I don't know what she meant. That was when Trump first got elected. And based on Reverend Barber today, I think we really need a transfer of power from the rich to the poor. That's it. It's not that hard, where people just make their own decisions, right? So we are united. We want to heal and move forward. I hope today's speakers gave you hope, but most importantly, concrete steps to move forward. I met Reverend Barber. I'm about to finish, because you don't give a policy debater a mic either. We used to have 8-minute constructive speeches. So this is where I get your ballot, because you're a judge. This is debate in high school. Teenage servant leader intern, Joy. Thank you for allowing me an opportunity at this angry world. I read Reverend Barber's Fusion Politics, which speaks to the power of brown, native, non-native alliances and how to transform passion and anger into healing and unity. He reminds me more than allyship. We need action. We need direct action. That's what he's talking about. Our elders are telling us what to do. Any ability, because every disability is an ability. People say, oh, our kids are disabled, or we have to put them on this, we have to it's the whole mass incarceration is our kids who are hurting. So please join us March 20th on the next steps to bringing more green spaces, health and nutrition, and power back to the children of Central Alameda, Oakland, and Richmond. I've seen those kids. I work with those Oakland kids. San Diego, listen to the children when they play, when they are happy. Listen to what happens to your own mental health when you can experience the kids play. It starts with self. The state of the children is the state of our soul. Let's put together and protect what's sacred on March 20th. I think this is just the beginning. Thank you so much, Professor, Kimmy, Ronaldo, Dominique, and Sylvia. They are amazing. They were nothing and laborious. So I hope that we are all in prayer and just move forward, and see you March 20th.
Thank you so much, Alfredo. No need to apologize. I think we're all with you and moving with you as you were speaking. But I know with the little time we have, Kimmy, if I could turn to you and get your perspective on some of the solutions and how to move forward, and then Jyoti will go to you to end. Thank you.
Sure. I definitely don't have a whole lot to add. I think everything that has been contributed has been a wealth of knowledge already. I just think it's worth noting that right now is a really interesting and pivotal time for people to, like, there's just so much more interest in transformative justice right now, like a lot of curiosity as to how we can respond to what we need without systems. So I think that's kind of where we start, is this shift away from believing that only systems can address what it is that the resolutions that we're seeking. And when we actually have so much to offer and so much power and agency to address some of those things ourselves. And especially during the pandemic, I think we're seeing so much mutual aid, a lot of things that are being demonstrated that don't involve systems. And these are practices that communities of color have been using, and transformative justice in itself has been, is emerged from communities that haven't been able to rely on systems to protect them or to address their needs or repair harm. So we've developed them ourselves. So I think about, Filipinos and our remittances back to the Philippines, that, it doesn't get funneled through foundations. It goes directly to families. It's about $33 billion annually of what we give. And it's the same practice of what we're seeing in terms of mutual aid right now. And so there's just this kind of, recognition that systems are not addressing our needs, and just the awareness that we have the ability to take care of ourselves in so many ways. I think many of you have heard of Angelo Quinto, who was a Filipino man who was murdered by Antioch police with the same hole that killed George Floyd. He was having a mental health breakdown just a few days before Christmas and was murdered by Antioch police. And sadly, his family had de-escalated the situation, but they shared that they didn't know what else to do but to call 911 at that point, And so that was like the one move that they recognized as being the mistake in that situation that actually led to his death. And so for us as a community, we've been talking more about, with mental health becoming an increasing issue for many communities, how do we then, develop the skills of our community members to be able to address mental health issues? Because that in itself is a shift in thinking that only police, fire, or even paramedics or mental health professionals are the ones that are able to respond to these crises, when we actually have a ton of skills ourselves in being able to do that. So these aren't necessarily huge shifts, but they are huge in terms of shifting paradigms, and even just small moves. I think, Ronnie, you mentioned like the need for centering love in relationships. That is really the shift that we need to see and embrace a lot more in order for us to do transformative change.
Thank you, Kimmy. And Jyoti, I know you wanted to wrap us up.
Sure. I wanted to lift several things that everybody said today, and I have four things that I'm going to say. One is that we learned today how powerful stories are. So stories matter. People's stories matter to move. I mean, we have to talk about these things in terms of people's lives. History matters because we can't disconnect our history and the land that we're on. For me, the Tongva land that we're on, in order to move forward. And this couple of other things. Second is budgets or value statements. So when Alfredo was talking about the money that was reallocated, those are value statements. And that's what I tell when I speak to officials, local officials, about safety. I talk about how your budget is a value statement. So you're valuing certain things. Third, I'd say to people, when you talk to elected officials, when you talk to people in power, ask them when they talk about safety, whose safety are they defining? And the last thing I'll say, and it kind of builds off of what Kimmy just said, which is, survey your own communities. Ask them what they want. Take that survey to people. Not the survey that they give you, not the results of the data that they give you, that they tell you this is what we're using to make our determinations, but go to your communities yourself and say, what is it that we need and what surveys do we need? And then I'm going to end where I started with the Arundhati's quote, which is when she said it's a portal and a gateway between one world and the next. I look forward to seeing all of you in the next world.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today. Jyoti, Kimmy, Ronnie, Alfredo, thank you so much for educating, for grounding, for inspiring us, for equipping us with the knowledge and the tools we need to not just reform, but to truly transform. And thank you for really showing yourselves for who you are and modeling who we all need to be. So thank you. And now to close this out, I'd like to turn us back to Shimica.
Thank you, Dominique. And that brings us to the end of our program. I want to thank you all and all our speakers. I am profoundly grateful for all of you joining us today and for all your work that you are doing in the community and inspiring us. It lives with us here at CDF California and reminds us that we're not alone in our pursuit to keep children and their families at the center of the conversations. And for our participants, I hope what you heard will stay in your minds and hearts. And when you return to your organizations and agencies, universities, boardrooms, churches, communities, neighborhoods, that you'll take a moment, look around and think about where the children and youth are. Who is watching out for them? How are they faring? And when you make decisions in your work, think about how it might affect children and their ability to grow up and play the cello like Hannah, or ride their bike in their neighborhood, or go to college, or buy a house, or follow whatever dream they may have. And I just want to lift up what Alfredo already so eloquently said, which is the state of our children is the state of our soul, and to not forget that as you encounter the children in your lives. So in closing, I'd like to ask that you would share what you learned today on social media. Look out for an email from us to explaining how to do that. And I know that after 4 hours of weighty and important dialogue, some of you already asked about our Altitude of Freedom School video. And I think it's just appropriate if you missed it to see it again. And if you saw it, to be able to just lead us out with the joyous voices of our children. Thank you for being here.
I want peace on my block, so I can walk to the store. I don't wanna have to hear no gunshots no more.
I'm allergic to the trash. Let's get past all the violence. They want me to stay quiet, but I won't stay silent. They won't believe a child, so I'm coming with the stats. Every 234, one more, that's facts. Too many to name. Yo, it's such a shame. I'm calling out the shooters from the police to the gangs.
Oh, yo, we don't want no smoke. Oh, yo, tell them we don't want no smoke.
I take you to the White House. These cannons out here wildin' out, but I can't shut my mouth about what's affecting my house.
Put us over guns, we can't rest until it's done. Till our babies being killed equates to white mother sons.
Too much hate that fill the news. They shooting up the schools. Country mixed with WAP, but they giving me the blues. Family fire lethal, to me it seems evil. Protecting all the triggers, but not thinking about the people.
Oh, yo, we don't want no smoke. Oh, yo, tell them we don't want no smoke.
My name is Lil Z, aka Baby Blaze. Pasadena was the place I was raised. I came to Freedom School just to spend my summer days. But I can make a change. Let's start off with apologies. I'm tired of apologies. Dreams are getting killed, but success will come and follow me.
Freedom school's a movement. Who ready to go? He don't want no, she don't want no, we don't want no smoke.